Chapter 21 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Beth Blackburn. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 21. The Six Hungry Beasts. Once upon a time there lived a man who dwelt with his wife in a little hut, far away from any neighbors. But they did not mind being alone, and would have been quite happy if it had not been for a marten, who came every night to their poultry yard and carried off one of their fowls. The man laid all sorts of traps to catch the thief, but instead of capturing the foe, it happened that one day he caught himself, and, falling down, struck his head against a stone and was killed. Not long after, the marten came by on the lookout for his supper. Seeing the dead man lying there, he said to himself, "That is a prize. This time I have done well," and dragging the body with great difficulty to the sledge which was waiting for him, drove off with his booty. He had not driven far when he met a squirrel, who bowed and said, "Good morning, godfather. What have you got behind you?" The marten laughed and answered, "Did you ever hear anything so strange? The old man that you see here set traps about his hen house, thinking to catch me, but he fell into his own trap and broke his own neck. He is very heavy. I wish you would help me to draw the sledge." The squirrel did as he was asked, and the sledge moved slowly along. By and by a hare came running across a field, but stopped to see what wonderful thing was coming. "What have you got there?" she asked, and the marten told his story and begged the hare to help them pull. The hare pulled her hardest, and after a while they were joined by a fox, and then by a wolf, and at length a bear was added to the company, and he was of more use than all the other 5 beasts put together. Besides, when the whole 6 had supped off the man, he was not so heavy to draw. The worst of it was that they soon began to get hungry again, and the wolf, who was hungriest of all, said to the rest, "What shall we eat now, my friends, as there is no more man?" "I suppose we shall have to eat the smallest of us," replied the bear, and the marten turned round to seize the squirrel, who was much smaller than any of the rest. But the squirrel ran up a tree like lightning, and the marten, remembering, just in time, that he was the next in size, slipped quick as a thought into a hole in the rocks. "What shall we eat now?" asked the wolf again, when he had recovered from his surprise. "We must eat the smallest of us," repeated the bear, stretching out a paw towards the hare, but the hare was not a hare for nothing, and before the paw had touched her, she had darted deep into the wood. Now that the squirrel, the marten, and the hare had all gone, the fox was the smallest of the 3 who were left, and the wolf and the bear explained that they were very sorry, but they would have to eat him. Michael, the fox, did not run away as the others had done, but smiled in a friendly manner, and remarked, "Things taste so stale in a valley, one's appetite is so much better up on a mountain." The wolf and the bear agreed, and they turned out of the hollow where they had been walking, and chose a path that led up the mountain side. The fox trotted cheerfully by his 2 big companions, but on the way he managed to whisper to the wolf, "Tell me, Peter, when I am eaten, what will you have for your next dinner?" The simple question seemed to put out the wolf very much. What would they have for their next dinner, and, what was more important still, who would be there to eat it? They had made a rule always to dine off the smallest of the party, and when the fox was gone, why, of course he was smaller than the bear. These thoughts flashed quickly through his head, and he said hastily, "Dear brothers, would it not be better for us to live together as comrades, and every one to hunt for the common dinner? Is not my plan a good one?" "It is the best thing I have ever heard," answered the fox, and as they were 2 to 1, the bear had to be content, though in his heart he would have much preferred a good dinner at once to any friendship. For a few days all went well. There was plenty of game in the forest, and even the wolf had as much to eat as he could wish. One morning the fox, as usual, was going his rounds when he noticed a tall, slender tree with a magpie's nest in one of the top branches. Now the fox was particularly fond of young magpies, and he set about making a plan by which he could have one for dinner. At last he hit upon something which he thought would do, and accordingly he sat down near the tree and began to stare hard at it. "What are you looking at, Michael?" asked the magpie, who was watching him from a bough. "I'm looking at this tree. It has just struck me what a good tree it would be to cut my new snowshoes out of." But at this answer the magpie screeched loudly and exclaimed, "Oh, not this tree, dear brother, I implore you! I have built my nest on it, and my young ones are not yet old enough to fly." "It will not be easy to find another tree that would make such good snowshoes," answered the fox, cocking his head on one side, and gazing at the tree thoughtfully. "But I do not like to be ill-natured, so if you will give me one of your young ones, I will seek my snowshoes elsewhere." Not knowing what to do, the poor magpie had to agree, and flying back with a heavy heart, he threw one of his young ones out of the nest. The fox seized it in his mouth and ran off in triumph, while the magpie, though deeply grieved for the loss of his little one, found some comfort in the thought that only a bird of extraordinary wisdom would have dreamed of saving the rest by the sacrifice of the one. But what do you think happened? Why, a few days later, Michael the fox might have been sitting under the very same tree, and a dreadful pang shot through the heart of the magpie as he peeped at him from a hole in the nest. "What are you looking at?" he asked in a trembling voice. "At this tree. I was just thinking what good snowshoes it would make," answered the fox in an absent voice, as if he was not thinking of what he was saying. "Oh, my brother, my dear little brother, don't do that!" cried the magpie, hopping about in his anguish. "You know you promised only a few days ago that you would get your snowshoes elsewhere." "So I did, but though I have searched through the whole forest, there is not a single tree that is as good as this. I am very sorry to put you out, but really it is not my fault. The only thing I can do for you is to offer to give up my new snowshoes altogether, if you will throw me down one of your young ones in exchange." And the poor magpie, in spite of his wisdom, was obliged to throw another of his little ones out of the nest, and this time he was not able to console himself with the thought that he might have been much cleverer than other people. He sat on the edge of his nest, his head drooping and his feathers all ruffled, looking the picture of misery. Indeed, he was so different from the gay, jaunty magpie whom every creature in the forest knew, that a crow who was flying past stopped to inquire what was the matter. "Where are the two young ones who are not in the nest?" asked he. "I had to give them to the fox," replied the magpie in a quivering voice. "He has been here twice in the last week, and wanted to cut down my tree for the purpose of making snowshoes out of it, and the only way I could buy him off was by giving him two of my young ones." "Oh, you fool!" cried the crow. "The fox was only trying to frighten you. He could not have cut down the tree, for he has neither axe nor knife. Dear me, to think that you have sacrificed your young ones for nothing! Dear, dear, how could you be so very foolish?" And the crow flew away, leaving the magpie overcome with shame and sorrow. The next morning the fox came to his usual place in front of the tree, for he was hungry, and a nice young magpie would have suited him very well for dinner. But this time there was no cowering, timid magpie to do his bidding, but a bird with his head erect and a determined voice. "My good fox," said the magpie, putting his hand on one side and looking very wise, "my good fox, if you take my advice, you will go home as fast as you can. There is no use your talking about making snowshoes out of this tree, when you have neither knife nor axe to cut it down with." "Who has been teaching you wisdom?" asked the fox, forgetting his manners in his surprise at this new turn of affairs. "The crow, who paid me a visit yesterday," answered the magpie. "The crow, was it?" said the fox. "Well, the crow had better not meet me for the future, or it may be the worse for him." As Michael, the cunning beast, had no desire to continue the conversation, he left the forest. But when he came to the high road he laid himself at full length on the ground, stretching himself out, just as if he was dead. Very soon he noticed, out of the corner of his eye, that the crow was flying towards him, and he kept stiller and stiffer than ever, with his tongue hanging out of his mouth. The crow, who wanted her supper very badly, hopped quickly towards him, and was stooping forward to peck at his tongue when the fox gave a snap, and caught him by the wing. The crow knew that it was of no use struggling, so he said, "Ah, brother, if you are really going to eat me, do it, I beg of you, in good style. Throw me first over this precipice, so that my feathers may be strewn here and there, and that all who see them may know that your cunning is greater than mine." This idea pleased the fox, for he had not yet forgiven the crow for depriving him of the young magpies, so he carried the crow to the edge of the precipice and threw him over, intending to go round by a path he knew, and pick him up at the bottom. But no sooner had the fox let the crow go than he soared up into the air, and hovering just out of reach of his enemy's claws, he cried with a laugh, "Ah, fox! You know well how to catch, but you cannot keep." With his tail between his legs, the fox slunk into the forest. He did not know where to look for a dinner, as he guessed that the crow would have flown back before him, and put everyone on their guard. The notion of going to bed supperless was very unpleasant to him, and he was wondering what in the world he should do, when he chanced to meet his old friend the bear. This poor animal had just lost his wife, and was going to get someone to mourn over her, for he felt her loss greatly. He had hardly left his comfortable cave when he had come across the wolf, who inquired where he was going. "I'm going to find a mourner," answered the bear, and told his story. "Oh, let me mourn for you!" cried the wolf. "Do you understand how to howl?" said the bear. "Oh, certainly, godfather, certainly," replied the wolf. But the bear said he should like to have a specimen of his howling, to make sure that he knew his business. So the wolf broke forth in his song of lament. "Hoo, hoo, hoo, hum, ho!" he shouted, and he made such a noise that the bear put up his paws to his ears and begged him to stop. "You have no idea how it is done. Be off with you," he said angrily. A little further down the road the hare was resting in a ditch, but when she saw the bear she came out and spoke to him, and inquired why he looked so sad. The bear told her of the loss of his wife, and of his search for a mourner that could lament over her in the proper style. The hare instantly offered her services, but the bear took care to ask her to give him a proof of her talents before she accepted them. "Pooh, pooh, pooh, pum, poh," piped the hare, but this time her voice was so small that the bear could hardly hear her. "That is not what I want," he said. "I will bid you good morning." It was after this that the fox came up, and he also was struck with the bear's altered looks, and stopped. "What is the matter with you, godfather?" asked he, "and where are you going?" "I am going to find a mourner for my wife," answered the bear. "Oh, do choose me!" cried the fox, and the bear looked at him thoughtfully. "Can you howl well?" he said. "Yes, beautifully. Just listen." And the fox lifted up his voice and sang weeping, "Loo, loo, loo! The famous spinner, the baker of good cakes, the prudent housekeeper is torn from her husband. Loo, loo, loo! She is gone! She is gone!" "Now at last I have found someone who knows the art of lamentation," exclaimed the bear, quite delighted, and he led the fox back to his cave, and bade him begin his lament over the dead wife who was lying stretched out on her bed of grey moss. But this did not suit the fox at all. "One cannot wail properly in this cave," he said. "It is much too damp. You had better take the body to the storehouse. It will sound much finer there." So the bear carried his wife's body to the storehouse, while he himself went back to the cave to cook some pap for the mourner. From time to time he paused and listened for the sound of wailing, but he heard nothing. At last he went to the door of the storehouse and called to the fox, "Why don't you howl, godfather? What are you about?" And the fox, who, instead of weeping over the dead bear, had been quietly eating her, answered, "There only remain now her legs and the soles of her feet. Give me 5 minutes more and they will be gone also." When the bear heard that he ran back for the kitchen ladle, to give the traitor the beating he deserved. But as he opened the door of the storehouse, Michael was ready for him, and slipping between his legs dashed straight off into the forest. The bear, seeing that the traitor had escaped, flung the ladle after him, and it just caught the tip of his tail, and that is how there comes to be a spot of white on the tails of all foxes. End of chapter 21. The Six Hungry Beasts.
Chapter 22 of The Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Patrick Reinhardt. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 22. How the Beggar Boy Turned into Count Piro. Once upon a time there lived a man who had only one son, a lazy, stupid boy who would never do anything he was told. When the father was dying, he sent for his son, and told him that he would soon be left alone in the world, with no possessions but the small cottage they lived in, and a pear tree which grew behind it, and that, whether he liked it or not, he would have to work, or else he would starve. Then the old man died. But the boy did not work. Instead, he idled about as before, contenting himself with eating the pears off his tree, which, unlike other pear trees, before or since, bore fruit the whole year round. Indeed, the pears were so much finer than any you could get even in the autumn, that one day, in the middle of the winter, they attracted the notice of a fox who was creeping by. "Dear me, what lovely pears!" he said to the youth. "Do give me a basket of them. It will bring you luck." "Ah, little fox, but if I give you a basketful, what am I to eat?" asked the boy. "Oh, trust me, and do what I tell you," said the fox. "I know it will bring you luck." So the boy got up and picked some of the ripest pears and put them into a rush basket. The fox thanked him, and, taking the basket in his mouth, trotted off to the king's palace, and made his way straight to the king. "Your Majesty, my master sends you a few of his best pears, and begs you will graciously accept them," he said, laying the basket at the feet of the king. "Pears! At this season?" cried the king, peering down to look at them. "And pray, who is your master?" "The Count Piro," answered the fox. "But how does he manage to get pears in midwinter?" asked the king. "Oh, he has everything he wants," replied the fox. "He is richer even than you are, your Majesty." "Then what can I send him in return for his pears?" said the king. "Nothing, your Majesty, or you would hurt his feelings," answered the fox. "Well, tell him how heartily I thank him, and how much I shall enjoy them." And the fox went away. He trotted back to the cottage with his empty basket and told his tale, but the youth did not seem as pleased to hear as the fox was to tell. "But, my dear little fox," said he, "you have brought me nothing in return, and I am so hungry." "Let me alone," replied the fox. "I know what I am doing. You will see. It will bring you luck." A few days after this the fox came back again. "I must have another basket of pears," said he. "Ah, little fox, what shall I eat if you take away all my pears?" answered the youth. "Be quiet, it will be all right," said the fox, and taking a bigger basket than before, he filled it quite full of pears. Then he picked it up in his mouth, and trotted off to the palace. "Your Majesty, as you seem to like the first basket of pears, I have brought you some more," said he, "with my master, the Count Piro's humble respects." "Now, surely it is not possible to grow such pears with deep snow on the ground?" cried the king. "Oh, that never affects them," answered the fox lightly. "He is rich enough to do anything. But today he sends me to ask if you will give him your daughter in marriage." "If he is so much richer than I am," said the king, "I shall be obliged to refuse. My honor would not permit me to accept his offer." "Oh, your Majesty, you must not think that," replied the fox, "and do not let the question of a dowry trouble you. The Count Piro would not dream of asking anything but the hand of the princess." "Is he really so rich that he can do without a dowry?" asked the king. "Did I not tell your Majesty that he was richer than you?" answered the fox reproachfully. "Well, beg him to come here, that we may talk together," said the king. So the fox went back to the young man and said, "I have told the king that you are Count Piro, and have asked his daughter in marriage." "Oh, little fox, what have you done?" cried the youth in dismay. "When the king sees me he will order my head to be cut off." "Oh, no, he won't," replied the fox. "Just do as I tell you." And he went off to the town, and stopped at the house of the best tailor. "My master, the Count Piro, begs that you will send him at once the finest coat that you have in your shop," said the fox, putting on his grandest air, "and if it fits him I will call and pay for it tomorrow. Indeed, as he is in a great hurry, perhaps it might be as well if I took it round myself." The tailor was not accustomed to serve counts, and he at once got out all the coats he had ready. The fox chose out a beautiful one of white and silver, bade the tailor tie it up in a parcel, and carrying the string in his teeth, he left the shop, and went to a horse dealer's, whom he persuaded to send his finest horse round to the cottage, saying that the king had bidden his master to the palace. Very unwittingly the young man put on the coat and mounted the horse, and rode up to meet the king, with the fox running before him. "What am I to say to his Majesty, little fox?" he asked anxiously. "You know that I have never spoken to a king before." "Say nothing," answered the fox, "but leave the talking to me. 'Good morning, your Majesty,' will be all that is necessary for you." By this time they had reached the palace, and the king came to the door to receive Count Piro, and led him to the great hall, where a feast was spread. The princess was already seated at the table, but was as dumb as Count Piro himself. "The count speaks very little," the king said at last to the fox, and the fox answered, "He has so much to think about in the management of his property that he cannot afford to talk like ordinary people." The king was quite satisfied, and they finished dinner, after which Count Piro and the fox took leave. The next morning the fox came round again. "Give me another basket of pears," he said. "Very well, little fox, but remember it may cost me my life," answered the youth. "Oh, leave it to me, and do as I tell you, and you will see that in the end it will bring you luck," answered the fox, and plucking the pears he took them up to the king. "My master, Count Piro, sends you these pears," he said, "and asks for an answer to his proposal." "Tell the count that the wedding can take place whenever he pleases," answered the king, and, filled with pride, the fox trotted back to deliver his message. "But I can't bring the princess here, little fox," cried the young man in dismay. "You leave everything to me," answered the fox. "Have I not managed well so far?" And up at the palace preparations were made for a grand wedding, and the youth was married to the princess. After a week of feasting, the fox said to the king, "My master wishes to take his young bride home to his own castle." "Very well, I will accompany them," replied the king, and he ordered his courtiers and attendants to get ready, and the best horses in his stable to be brought out for himself, Count Piro, and the princess. So they all set out, and rode across the plain, the little fox running before them. He stopped at the sight of a great flock of sheep, which was feeding peacefully on the rich grass. "To whom do these sheep belong?" asked he of the shepherd. "To an ogre," replied the shepherd. "Hush!" said the fox in a mysterious manner. "Do you see that crowd of armed men riding along? If you were to tell them that those sheep belong to an ogre, they would kill them, and then the ogre would kill you. If they ask, just say the sheep belong to Count Piro. It will be better for everybody." And the fox ran hastily on, as he did not wish to be seen talking to the shepherd. Very soon the king came up. "What beautiful sheep!" he said, drawing up his horse. "I have none so fine in my pastures. Whose are they?" "Count Piro's," answered the shepherd, who did not know the king. Well, he must be a very rich man, thought the king to himself, and rejoiced that he had such a wealthy son-in-law. Meanwhile the fox had met with a huge herd of pigs snuffling about the roots of some trees. "To whom do these pigs belong?" he asked of the swineherd. "To an ogre," replied he. "Hush!" whispered the fox, though nobody could hear him. "Do you see that troop of armed men riding toward us? If you tell them that the pigs belong to the ogre they will kill them, and then the ogre will kill you. If they ask, just say that the pigs belong to Count Piro. It will be better for everybody." And he ran hastily on. Soon after the king rode up. "What fine pigs!" he said, reining in his horse. "They are fatter than any I have got on my farms. Whose are they?" "Count Piro's," answered the swineherd, who did not know the king, and again the king felt he was lucky to have such a rich son-in-law. This time the fox ran faster than before, and in a flowery meadow he found a troop of horses feeding. "Whose horses are these?" he asked of the man who was watching them. "An ogre's," replied he. "Hush!" whispered the fox. "Do you see that crowd of armed men coming toward us? If you tell them the horses belong to an ogre they will drive them off, and then the ogre will kill you. If they ask, just say they are Count Piro's. It will be better for everybody." And he ran on again. In a few minutes the king rode up. "Oh, what lovely creatures! How I wish they were mine!" he exclaimed. "Whose are they?" "Count Piro's," answered the man, who did not know the king, and the king's heart leapt, as he thought that if they belonged to his rich son-in-law, they were as good as his. At last the fox came to the castle of the ogre himself. He ran up the steps, with tears falling from his eyes, and crying: "Oh, you poor, poor people, what a sad fate is yours!" "What has happened?" asked the ogre, trembling with fright. "Do you see that troop of horsemen who are riding along the road? They are sent by the king to kill you." "Oh, dear little fox, help us, we implore you!" cried the ogre and his wife. "Well, I will do what I can," answered the fox. "The best place is for you both to hide in the big oven, and when the soldiers have gone by I will let you out." The ogre and ogress scrambled into the oven as quick as thought, and the fox banged the door on them. Just as he did so the king came up. "Do us the honour to dismount, your majesty," said the fox, bowing low. "This is the palace of Count Piro." "Why, it is more splendid than my own!" exclaimed the king, looking round on all the beautiful things that filled the hall. "But why are there no servants? His Excellency the Count Piro wished the princess to choose them for herself," answered the fox, and the king nodded his approval. He then rode on, leaving the bridal pair in the castle. But when it was dark and all was still, the fox crept downstairs and lit the kitchen fire, and the ogre and his wife were burned to death. The next morning the fox said to Count Piro: "Now that you are rich and happy, you have no more need of me, but before I go there is one thing I must ask of you in return. When I die, promise me that you will give me a magnificent coffin, and bury me with due honours." "Oh, little fox, don't talk of dying," cried the princess, nearly weeping, for she had taken a great liking to the fox. After some time the fox thought he would see if the Count Piro was really grateful to him for all he had done, and went back to the castle, where he lay down on the doorstep and pretended to be dead. The princess was just going out for a walk, and directly she saw him lying there she burst into tears, and fell on her knees beside him. "My dear little fox, you are not dead," she wailed. "You poor, poor little creature, you shall have the finest coffin in the world." "A coffin for an animal?" said Count Piro. "What nonsense! Just take him by the leg and throw him into the ditch." Then the fox sprang up and cried, "You wretched, thankless beggar, have you forgotten that you owe all your riches to me?" Count Piro was frightened when he heard these words, as he thought that perhaps the fox might have power to take away the castle, and leave him as poor as when he had nothing to eat but the pears off his tree. So he tried to soften the fox's anger, saying that he had only spoken in joke, as he had known quite well that he was not really dead. For the sake of the princess, the fox let himself be softened, and he lived in the castle for many years, and played with Count Piro's children. And when he actually did die, his coffin was made of silver, and Count Piro and his wife followed him to the grave. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Ferreira. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 23. The Rogue and the Herdsman. In a tiny cottage near the king's palace there once lived an old man, his wife, and his son, a very lazy fellow, who would never do a stroke of work. He could not be got even to look after their one cow, but left her to look after herself, while he lay on a bank and went to sleep in the sun. For a long time his father bore with him, hoping that as he grew older he might gain more sense, but at last the old man's patience was worn out, and he told his son that he should not stay at house in idleness, and must go out into the world to seek his fortune. The young man saw that there was no help for it, and he set out with a wallet full of food over his shoulder. At length he came to a large house, at the door of which he knocked. "What do you want?" asked the old man who opened it. And the youth told him how his father had turned him out of his house because he was so lazy and stupid, and he needed shelter for the night. "That you shall have," replied the man, "but tomorrow I shall give you some work to do, for you must know that I am the chief herdsman of the king." The youth made no answer to this. He felt, if he was to be made to work at all, that he might as well have stayed where he was. But as he did not see any other way of getting a bed, he went slowly in. The herdsman's 2 daughters and their mother were sitting at supper, and invited him to join them. Nothing more was said about work, and when the meal was over they all went to bed. In the morning, when the young man was dressed, the herdsman called to him and said, "Now listen, and I will tell you what you have to do." "What is it?" asked the youth, sulkily. "Nothing less than to look after 200 pigs," was the reply. "Oh, I'm used to that," answered the youth. "Yes, but this time you will have to do it properly," said the herdsman, and he took the youth to the place where the pigs were feeding, and he told him to drive them to the woods on the side of the mountain. This the young man did, but as soon as they reached the outskirts of the mountain they grew quite wild, and would have run away altogether, had they not luckily gone toward a narrow ravine, from which the youth easily drove them home to his father's cottage. "Where do all these pigs come from, and how did you get them?" asked the old man in surprise, when his son knocked at the door of the hut he had left only the day before. "They belong to the king's chief herdsman," answered his son. "He gave them to me to look after, but I knew I could not do it, so I drove them straight to you. Now make the best of your good fortune, and kill them and hang them up at once." "What are you talking about?" cried the father, pale with horror. "We should certainly both be put to death if I did any such thing." "No, no, do as I tell you, and I will get out of it somehow," replied the young man. And in the end he had his way. The pigs were killed, and laid side by side in a row. Then he cut off the tails and tied them together with a piece of cord, and swinging the bundle over his back he returned to the place where they should have been feeding. Here there was a small swamp, which was just what he wanted, and finding a large stone he fastened the rope to it and sank it in the swamp, after which he arranged the tails carefully one by one, so that only their points were seen sticking out of the water. When everything was in order he hastened home to his master with such a sorrowful face that the herdsman saw at once that something dreadful had happened. "Where are the pigs?" asked he. "Oh, don't speak of them!" answered the young man. "I really can hardly tell you. The moment they got into the field they became quite mad, and each ran in a different direction. I ran too, hither and thither, but as fast as I caught one another was off, till I was in despair. At last, however, I collected them all and was about to drive them back, when suddenly they rushed down the hill into the swamp, where they vanished completely, leaving only the points of their tails, which you can see for yourself." "You have made up that story very well," replied the herdsman. "No, it's the real truth. Come with me and I'll prove it." And they went together to the spot, and there sure enough were the points of the tails sticking up out of the water. The herdsman laid hold of the nearest and pulled at it with all his might, but it was no use, for the stone and the rope held them all fast. He called to the young man to help him, but the two did not succeed any better than the one had done. "Yes, your story was true after all. It is a wonderful thing," said the herdsman. "But I see it is no fault of yours, and I must put up with my loss as well as I can. Now let us return home, for it is time for supper." Next morning the herdsman said to the young man, "I have got some other work for you to do. Today you must take 100 sheep to graze, but be careful that no harm befalls them." "I will do my best," replied the youth, and he opened the gate of the fold, where the sheep had been all night, and drove them out into the meadow. But in a short time they grew as wild as the pigs had done, and scattered in all directions. The young man could not collect them, try as he would, and he thought to himself that this was the punishment for his laziness in refusing to look after his father's one cow. At last, however, the sheep seemed tired of running about, and then the youth managed to gather them together, and drove them, as before, straight to his father's house. "Whose sheep are these, and what are they doing here?" asked the old man in wonder, and his son told him. But when the tale was ended the father shook his head. "Give up these bad ways and take them back to your master," said he. "No, no," answered the youth. "I am not so stupid as that. We will kill them and have them for dinner." "You will lose your life if you do," replied the father. "Oh, I am not sure of that," said the son. "And anyway, I will have my will for once." And he killed all the sheep and laid them on the grass, but he cut off the head of the ram which always led the flock and had bells round its horns. Then he took back to the place where they should have been feeding, for here he had noticed a high rock with a patch of green grass in the middle, and 2 or 3 thick bushes growing on the edge. Up this rock he climbed with great difficulty, and fastened the ram's head to the bushes with a cord, leaving only the tips of the horns with the bells visible. As there was a soft breeze blowing, the bushes to which the head was tied moved gently, and the bells rang. When all was done to his liking, he hastened quickly back to his master. "Where are the sheep?" asked the herdsman, as the young man, panting, ran up the steps. "Oh, don't speak of them," answered he. "It's only by a miracle that I am here myself." "Tell me at once what has happened," said the herdsman sternly. The youth began to sob, and stammered out, "I hardly know how to tell you. They were so troublesome that I could not manage them at all. They ran about in all directions, and I ran after them and nearly died of fatigue. Then I heard a noise which I thought was the wind, but it was the sheep, which before my very eyes were carried straight up into the air. I stood watching them as if I was turned to stone, and there kept ringing in my ears the sound of the bells on the ram which led them." "That is nothing but a lie from beginning to end," said the herdsman. "No, it is as true as that there is a sun in heaven," answered the young man. "Then give me a proof of it," cried his master. "Well, come with me," said the youth. By this time it was evening and the dusk was falling. The young man brought the herdsman to the foot of the great rock, but it was so dark you could hardly see. Still the sound of sheep bells rang softly from above, and the herdsman knew them to be those he had hung on the horns of his ram. "Do you hear?" asked the youth. "Yes, I hear. You have spoken the truth, and I cannot blame you for what has happened. I must bear the loss as best as I can." He turned and went home, followed by the young man, who felt highly pleased with his own cleverness. "I should not be surprised if the tasks I set you were too difficult, and that you were tired of them," said the herdsman next morning. "But today I have something quite easy for you to do. You must look after 40 oxen, and be sure you are very careful, for one of them has gold-tipped horns and hoofs, and the king reckons it among his greatest treasures." The young man drove out the oxen into the meadow, and no sooner had they got there than, like the sheep and the pigs, they began to scamper in all directions, the precious bull being the wildest of all. As the youth stood watching them, not knowing what to do next, it came into his head that his father's cow was put out to grass at no great distance, and he forthwith made such a noise that he quite frightened the oxen, who were easily persuaded to take the path he wished. When they heard the cow lowing, they galloped all the faster, and soon they all arrived at his father's house. The old man was standing before the door of his hut when the great herd of animals dashed round a corner of the road, with his son and his own cow at their head. "Whose cattle are these, and why are they here?" he asked, and his son told him the story. "Take them back to your master as soon as you can," said the old man, but the son only laughed and said, "No, no, they're a present for you, they'll make you fat." For a long while the old man refused to have anything to do with such a wicked scheme, but his son talked him over in the end, and they killed the oxen as they had killed the sheep and the pigs. Last of all they came to the king's cherished ox. The son had a rope ready to cast round its horns and throw it to the ground, but the ox was stronger than the rope and soon tore it in pieces. Then it dashed away to the wood, the youth following. Over hedges and ditches they both went till they reached the rocky pass which bordered the herdsman's land. Here the ox, thinking itself safe, stopped to rest, and thus gave the young man a chance to come up with it. Not knowing how to catch it, he collected all the wood he could find and made a circle of fire around the ox, who by this time had fallen asleep, and did not wake till the fire had caught its head, and it was too late for it to escape. Then the young man, who had been watching, ran home to his master. "You have been away a long while," said the herdsman. "Where are the cattle?" The young man gasped, and seemed as if he was unable to speak. At last he answered, "It's always the same story. The oxen are gone, gone." "Gone?" cried the herdsman. "Scoundrel, you lie!" "I am telling you the exact truth," answered the young man. "Directly we came to the meadow they grew so wild that I could not keep them together. Then the big ox broke away, and the others followed till they all disappeared down a deep hole into the earth. It seemed to me that I heard sounds of bellowing, and I thought I recognized the voice of the golden horned ox, but when I got to the place from which the sounds had come, I could neither see nor hear anything in the hole itself, though there were traces of fire all around it." "Wretch!" cried the herdsman, when he had heard this story, "even if you did not lie before, you are lying now." "No, master, I am speaking the truth. Come and see for yourself." "If I find you have deceived me, you are a dead man," said the herdsman, and they went out together. "What do you call that?" asked the youth, and the herdsman looked and saw the traces of a fire which seemed to have sprung up from under the earth. "Wonder upon wonder!" he exclaimed. "So you really did speak the truth after all. Well, I cannot reproach you, though I shall have to pay heavily to my royal master for the value of that ox. But come, let us go home. I will never set you to herd cattle again. Henceforward I will give you something easier to do." "I have thought of exactly the thing for you," said the herdsman as they walked along, "and it is so simple that you cannot make a mistake. Just make me 10 scythes, one for every man, for I want the grass mown in one of my meadows to-morrow." At these words the youth's heart sank, for he had never been trained either as a smith or a joiner. However, he dared not say so, but smiled and nodded. Slowly and sadly he went to bed, but he could not sleep, for wondering how the scythes were to be made. All the skill and cunning he had shown before was of no use to him now, and after thinking about the scythes for many hours, there seemed only one way open to him. So, listening to make sure that all was still, he stole away to his parents and told them the whole story. When they had heard everything, they hid him where no one could find him. Time passed away, and the young man stayed at home doing all his parents bade him, and showing himself very different from what he had been before he went out to see the world. But one day he said to his father that he should like to marry, and have a house of his own. "When I served the king's chief herdsman," added he, "I saw his daughter, and I am resolved to try if I cannot win her for my wife." "It will cost you your life if you do," answered the father, shaking his head. "Well, I will do my best," replied his son, "but first give me the sword which hangs over your bed." The old man did not understand what good the sword would do, however he took it down, and the young man went his way. Late in the evening he arrived at the house of the herdsman, and knocked at the door, which was opened by a little boy. "I want to speak to your master," said he. "So it is you?" cried the herdsman, when he had received the message. "Well, you can sleep here tonight, if you wish." "I have come for something else besides a bed," replied the young man, drawing his sword, "and if you do not promise to give me your youngest daughter as my wife, I will stab you through the heart." What could the poor man do but promise? And he fetched his youngest daughter, who seemed quite pleased at the proposed match, and gave the youth her hand. Then the young man went home to his parents, and bade them get ready to welcome his bride. And when the wedding was over, he told his father-in-law, the herdsman, what he had done with the sheep, and pigs, and cattle. By and by the story came to the king's ears, and he thought that a man who was so clever was just the man to govern the country. So he made him his minister, and after the king himself there was no one so great as he. From Islandish Marchen. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Beth Blackburn. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 24. Eisenkopf. Once upon a time there lived an old man who had only one son, whom he loved dearly, but they were very poor, and often had scarcely enough to eat. Then the old man fell ill, and things grew worse than ever, so he called his son and said to him: "My dear boy, I have no longer any food to give you, and you must go into the world and get it for yourself. It does not matter what work you do, but remember, if you do it well and are faithful to your master, you will always have your reward." So Peter put a piece of black bread in his knapsack, and strapping it on his back, took a stout stick in his hand, and set out to seek his fortune. For a long while he travelled on, and nobody seemed to want him. But one day he met an old man, and being a polite youth, he took off his hat and said, "Good morning," in a pleasant voice. "Good morning," answered the man, "and where are you going?" "I am wandering through the country trying to get work," replied Peter. "Then stay with me, for I can give you plenty," said the old man, and Peter stayed. His work did not seem hard, for he had only 2 horses and a cow to see after, and though he had been hired for a year, the year consisted of but 3 days, so that it was not long before he received his wages. In payment the old man gave him a nut, and offered to keep him for another year, but Peter was homesick, and besides, he would rather have been paid ever so small a piece of money than a nut, for, thought he, nuts grow on every tree, and I can gather as many as I like. However, he did not say this to the old man, who had been kind to him, but just bade him farewell. The nearer Peter drew to his father's house, the more ashamed he felt at having brought back such poor wages. What could one nut do for him? Why, it would not buy even a slice of bacon. It was no use taking it home. He might as well eat it. So he sat down on a stone and cracked it with his teeth, and then took it out of his mouth to break off the shell. But who would ever guess what came out of that nut? Why, horses and oxen and sheep stepped out in such numbers that they seemed as if they would stretch to the world's end. The sight gave Peter such a shock that he wrung his hands in dismay. What was he to do with all these creatures? Where was he to put them? He stood and gazed in terror, and at this moment Eisenkopf came by. "What is the matter, young man?" asked he. "Oh, my friend, there is plenty the matter," answered Peter. "I have gained a nut as my wages, and when I cracked it this crowd of beasts came out, and I don't know what to do with them all." "Listen to me, my son," said Eisenkopf. "If you will promise never to marry, I will drive them all back into the nut again." And at a whistle from the stranger, the animals all began crowding into the nut again, nearly tumbling over each other in their haste. When the last foot had got inside, the 2 halves of the shell shut close. Then Peter put it in his pocket and went on to the house. No sooner had he reached it than he cracked his nut for the second time, and out came the horses, sheep, and oxen again. Indeed, Peter thought that there were even more of them than before. The old man could not believe his eyes when he saw the multitudes of horses, oxen, and sheep standing before his door. "How did you come by all these?" he gasped as soon as he could speak, and the son told him the whole story, and of the promise he had given Eisenkopf. The next day some of the cattle were driven to market and sold, and with the money the old man was able to buy some of the fields and gardens round his house, and in a few months had grown the richest and most prosperous man in the whole village. Everything seemed to turn gold in his hands, till one day, when he and his son were sitting in the orchard watching their herds of cattle grazing in the meadows, he suddenly said: "Peter, my boy, it is time that you were thinking of marrying." "But, my dear father, I told you I could never marry, because of the promise I gave to Eisenkopf." "Oh, one promises here and promises there, but no one ever thinks of keeping such promises. If Eisenkopf does not like your marrying, he will have to put up with it all the same. Besides, there stands in the stable a grey horse which is saddled night and day, and if Eisenkopf should show his face, you have only got to jump on the horse's back and ride away, and nobody on earth can catch you. When all is safe you will come back again, and we will live as happily as 2 fish in the sea." And so it all happened. The young man found a pretty brown-skinned girl who was willing to have him for a husband, and the whole village came to the wedding feast. The music was at its gayest, and the dance at its merriest, when Eisenkopf looked in at the window. "Oh ho, my brother, what is going on here? It has the air of being a wedding feast. Yet I fancied—was I mistaken?—that you had given me a promise that you would never marry." But Peter had not waited for the end of this speech. Scarcely had he seen Eisenkopf than he darted like the wind to the stable and flung himself on the horse's back. In another moment he was away over the mountain, with Eisenkopf running fast behind him. On they went through thick forests where the sun never shone, over a river so wide that it took a whole day to sail across them, up hills whose sides were all of glass. On they went through 7 times 7 countries till Peter reined in his horse before the house of an old woman. "Good day, mother," said he, jumping down and opening the door. "Good day, my son," answered she, "and what are you doing here at the world's end?" "I am flying for my life, mother, flying to the world which is beyond all worlds, for Eisenkopf is at my heels." "Come in and rest, then, and have some food, for I have a little dog who will begin to howl when Eisenkopf is still 7 miles off." So Peter went in and warmed himself and ate and drank until suddenly the dog began to howl. "Quick, my son, quick, you must go," cried the old woman, and the lightning itself was not quicker than Peter. "Stop a moment," cried the old woman again, just as he was mounting his horse. "Take this napkin and this cake, and put them in your bag where you can get hold of them easily." Peter took them and put them into his bag, and waving his thanks for her kindness, he was off like the wind. Round and round he rode, through 7 times 7 countries, through forests still thicker, and rivers still wider, and mountains still more slippery than the others he had passed, till at length he reached a house where dwelt another old woman. "Good day, mother," said he. "Good day, my son. What are you seeking here at the world's end?" "I am flying for my life, mother, flying to the world that is beyond all worlds, for Eisenkopf is at my heels." "Come in, my son, and have some food. I have a little dog who will begin to howl when Eisenkopf is still 7 miles off. So lie on this bed and rest yourself in peace." Then she went to the kitchen and baked a number of cakes, more than Peter could have eaten in a whole month. He had not finished a quarter of them when the dog began to howl. "Now, my son, you must go," cried the old woman, "but first put these cakes and this napkin in your bag where you can easily get at them." So Peter thanked her and was off like the wind. On he rode through 7 times 7 countries till he came to the house of a third old woman, who welcomed him as the others had done. But when the dog howled and Peter sprang up to go, she said, as she gave him the same gifts for his journey, "You have now 3 cakes and 3 napkins, for I know that my sisters have each given you one. Listen to me, and do what I tell you. Ride 7 days and nights straight before you, and on the 8th morning you will see a great fire. Strike it 3 times with the 3 napkins and it will part in 2. Then ride into the opening, and when you are in the middle of the opening, throw the 3 cakes behind your back with your left hand." Peter thanked her for her counsel, and was careful to do exactly all the old woman had told him. On the 8th morning he reached a fire so large that he could see nothing else on either side, but when he struck it with the napkins it parted, and stood on each hand like a wall. As he rode through the opening, he threw the cakes behind him. From each cake there sprang a huge dog, and he gave them the names of World's-Weight, Iron-Strong, and Quick-Ear. They bayed with joy at the sight of him, and as Peter turned to pat them, he beheld Eisenkopf at the edge of the fire, but the opening had closed up behind Peter, and he could not get through. "Stop, you promise-breaker!" shrieked he. "You have slipped through my hands once, but wait till I catch you again." Then he lay down by the fire and watched to see what would happen. When Peter knew he had nothing more to fear from Eisenkopf, he rode on slowly till he came to a small white house. Here he entered and found himself in a room where a gray-haired woman was spinning, and a beautiful girl was sitting on the window combing her golden hair. "What brings you here, my son?" asked the old woman. "I am seeking for a place, mother," answered Peter. "Stay with me then, for I need a servant," said the old woman. "With pleasure, mother," replied he. After that, Peter's life was a very happy one. He sowed and ploughed all day, except now and then when he took his dogs and went to hunt. And whatever game he brought back, the maiden with the golden hair knew how to dress it. One day the old woman had gone to the town to buy some flour, and Peter and the maiden were left alone in the house. They fell into talk, and she asked him where his home was, and how he had managed to come through the fire. Peter then told her the whole story, and of his striking the flames with the 3 napkins as he had been told to do. The maiden listened attentively, and wondered in herself whether what he had said was true. So after Peter had gone out to the fields, she crept up to his room and stole the napkins, and then set off as fast as she could to the fire by a path she knew of over the hill. At the 3rd blow she gave, the flames divided, and Eisenkopf, who had been watching and hoping for a chance of this kind, ran down the opening and stood before her. At this sight the maiden was almost frightened to death, but with a great effort she recovered herself and ran home as fast as her legs would carry her, closely pursued by Eisenkopf. Panting for breath, she rushed into the house and fell fainting on the floor, but Eisenkopf entered behind her and hid himself in the kitchen under the hearth. The next morning Peter locked up his dogs and went out into the forest alone. Eisenkopf, however, had seen him go, and followed so closely at his heels that Peter had barely time to clamber up a tall tree, where Eisenkopf could not reach him. "Come down at once, you gallows bird!" he cried. "Have you forgotten your promise that you would never marry?" "Oh, I know it is all up with me," answered Peter, "but let me call out 3 times." "You can call 100 times if you like," returned Eisenkopf, "for now I have got you in my power, and you shall pay for what you have done." "Iron strong, world's weight, Quick ear, fly to my help!" cried Peter. And Quick ear heard, and said to his brothers, "Listen, our master is calling us." "You are a dreaming fool," answered World's weight. "Why, he has not finished his breakfast." And he gave Quick ear a slap with his paw, for he was young and needed to be taught sense. "Iron strong, World's weight, Quick ear, fly to my help!" cried Peter again. This time World's weight heard also, and he said, "Ah, now our master is really calling." "How silly you are," answered Iron strong. "You know that at this hour he is always eating." And he gave World's weight a cuff, because he was old enough to know better. Peter sat trembling on the tree, dreading lest his dogs had never heard, or else that having heard, they had refused to come. It was his last chance, so making a mighty effort he shrieked once more, "Iron strong, World's weight, Quick ear, fly to my help, or I am a dead man." And Iron strong heard, and said, "Yes, he is certainly calling, we must go at once." And in an instant he had burst open the door, and all 3 were bounding away in the direction of the voice. When they reached the foot of the tree, Peter just said, "At him!" and in a few minutes there was nothing left of Eisenkopf. As soon as his enemy was dead, Peter got down and returned to the house, where he bade farewell to the woman and her daughter, who gave him a beautiful ring, all set with diamonds. It was really a magic ring, but neither Peter nor the maiden knew that. Peter's heart was heavy as he set out for home. He had ceased to love the wife whom he had left at his wedding feast, and his heart had gone out to the golden-haired girl. However, it was no use thinking of that, so he rode forward steadily. The fire had to be passed through before he had gone very far, and when he came to it, Peter shook the napkins 3 times in the flames, and a passage opened for Trim. But then a curious thing happened. The 3 dogs, who had followed at his heels all the way, now became 3 cakes again, which Peter put into his bag with the napkins. After that he stopped at the houses of the 3 old women, and gave each one back her napkin and her cake. "Where is my wife?" asked Peter when he reached home. "Oh, my dear son, why did you ever leave us? After you had vanished, no one knew where, your poor wife grew more and more wretched, and would neither eat nor drink. Little by little she faded away, and a month ago we laid her in her grave, to hide her sorrows under the earth." At this news Peter began to weep, for he had loved his wife before he went away, and had seen the golden-haired maiden. He went sorrowfully about his work for the space of half a year, when one night he dreamed that he moved the diamond ring given him by the maiden from his right hand, and put it on the wedding finger of the left. The dream was so real that he awoke at once and changed the ring from one hand to the other. And as he did so, guess what he saw? Why, the golden-haired girl standing before him. And he sprang up and kissed her, and said, "Now you are mine for ever and ever, and when we die, we will both be buried in one grave." And so they were. End of Eisenkopf. Recorded by Marybeth Blackburn at goldawardadventures.blogspot.com.
Chapter 25 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Imagine, The Crimson Fairy Book. Edited by Andrew Lang. The Death of Abu Nawas and of his wife. Once upon a time, there lived a man whose name was Abu Nawas, and he was a great favorite with the Sultan of the country, who had a palace in the same town where Abu Nawas dwelt. One day Abu Nawas came weeping into the hall of the palace where the Sultan was sitting, and said to him, "O mighty Sultan, my wife is dead." "That is bad news," replied the Sultan. "I must get you another wife." And he bade his Grand Vizier send for the Sultana. "This poor Abu Nawas has lost his wife," said he, when she entered the hall. "Oh, then we must get him another," answered the Sultana. "I have a girl that will suit him exactly," and clapped her hands loudly. At this signal a maiden appeared and stood before her. "I have got a husband for you," said the Sultana. "Who's he?" asked the girl. "Abu Nawas, the jester," replied the Sultana. "I will take him," answered the maid, and as Abu Nawas made no objection, it was all arranged. The Sultana had the most beautiful clothes made for the bride, and the Sultan gave the bridegroom his wedding suit, and 1,000 gold pieces into the bargain, and soft carpets for the house. So Abu Nawas took his wife home, and for some time they were very happy, and spent the money freely which the Sultan had given them, never thinking what they should do for more when that was gone. But come to an end it did, and they had to sell their fine things one by one, till at length nothing was left but a cloak apiece and one blanket to cover them. "We have run through our fortune," said Abu Nawas. "What are we to do now? I'm afraid to go back to the Sultan, for he will command his servants to turn me from the door. But you shall return to your mistress, and throw yourself at her feet and weep, and perhaps she will help us." "Oh, you had much better go," said the wife. "I shall not know what to say." "Well, then, stay at home, if you like," answered Abu Nawas, "and I will ask to be admitted to the Sultan's presence, and I will tell him, with sobs, that my wife is dead, and that I have no money for her burial. When he hears that, perhaps he will give us something." "Yes, that is a good plan," said the wife, and Abu Nawas set out. The Sultan was sitting in the Hall of Justice when Abu Nawas entered, his eyes streaming with tears, for he had dropped some pepper into them. They smarted dreadfully, and he could hardly see to walk straight, and everyone wondered what was the matter with him. "Abu Nawas, what has happened?" cried the Sultan. "Oh, noble Sultan, my wife is dead," wept he. "We must all die," answered the Sultan. But this was not the reply for which Abu Nawas had hoped. "True, O Sultan, but I have neither shroud to wrap her in, nor money to bury her with," went on Abu Nawas, in no wise abashed by the way the Sultan had received his news. "Well, give him 100 pieces of gold," said the Sultan, turning to the Grand Vizier. And when the money was counted out, Abu Nawas bowed low and left the hall, his tears still flowing, but with joy in his heart. "Have you got anything?" cried his wife, who was waiting for him anxiously. "Yes, 100 gold pieces," said he, throwing down the bag. "But that will not last us any time," Now you must go to the Sultana, clothed in sackcloth and robes of mourning, and tell her that your husband Abu Nawas is dead, and you have no money for his burial. When she hears that, she will be sure to ask you what has become of the money and the fine clothes they gave us on our marriage, and you will answer, 'Before he died he sold everything.'" The wife did as she was told, and wrapping herself in sackcloth, went up to the Sultana's own place, and as she was known to have been one of Subida's favourite attendants, she was taken without difficulty into the private apartments. "What is the matter?" inquired the Sultana, at the sight of the dismal figure. "My husband lays dead at home, and he has spent all our money, and sold everything, and I have nothing left to bury him with," sobbed the wife. Then Subida took up a purse containing 200 gold pieces, and said, "Your husband served us long and faithfully. You must see that he has a fine funeral." The wife took the money, and, kissing the feet of the Sultana, she joyfully hastened home. They spent some happy hours planning how they should spend it, and thinking how clever they had been. "When the Sultana goes this evening to Subida's place," said Abu Nawas, "she will be sure to tell him that Abu Nawas is dead." "Not Abu Nawas, it is his wife," he will reply, "and they will quarrel over it, and all the time we shall be sitting here enjoying ourselves. Oh, if they only knew how angry they would be!" As Abu Nawas had foreseen, the Sultan went, in the evening after his business was over, to pay his usual visit to the Sultana. "Poor Abu Nawas is dead," said Subida when he entered the room. "It is not Abu Nawas, but his wife who's dead," answered the Sultan. "No, really, you are quite wrong. She came to tell me herself only a couple of hours ago," replied Subida, "and as he had spent all their money, I gave her something to bury him with." "You must be dreaming," exclaimed the Sultan. Soon after midday Abu Nawas came into the hall, his eyes streaming with tears, and when I asked him the reason, he answered that his wife was dead, and they had sold everything they had, and he had nothing left, not so much as would bury her a shroud, far less for her burial. For a long time they talked, and neither would listen to the other, till the Sultan sent for the doorkeeper and bade him go instantly to the house of Abu Nawas, and see if it was the man or his wife who was dead. But Abu Nawas happened to be sitting with his wife behind the latticed window, which looked on the street, and he saw the man coming, and sprang up at once. "There is the Sultan's doorkeeper. They have sent him here to find out the truth. Throw yourself on the bed and pretend that you're dead." And in a moment the wife was stretched out stiffly, with the linen sheet spread across her like a corpse. She was only just in time, for the sheet was hardly drawn across her when the door opened and the porter came in. "Has anything happened?" asked he. "My poor wife is dead," replied Abu Nawas. "Look, she is laid out here." And the porter approached the bed, which was in the corner of the room, and saw the stiff form lying underneath. "We must all die," said he, and went back to the Sultan. "Well, have you found out which of them is dead?" asked the Sultan. "Yes, noble Sultan, it is the wife," replied the porter. "He only says that to please you," cried Subida in a rage, and calling to her chamberlain, she ordered him to go at once to the dwelling of Abu Nawas, and see which of the two was dead. "And be sure you tell the truth about it," added she, "or it will be the worse for you." As her chamberlain drew near the house, Abu Nawas caught sight of him. "There is the Sultana's chamberlain!" he exclaimed in a fright. "Now it is my turn to die. Be quick and spread the sheet over me." And he laid himself on the bed, and he held his breath when the chamberlain came in. "What are you weeping for?" asked the man, finding the wife in tears. "My husband is dead," answered she, pointing to the bed, and the chamberlain drew back the sheet and beheld Abu Nawas lying stiff and motionless. Then he gently replaced the sheet and returned to the palace. "Well, have you found out this time?" asked the Sultan. "My lord, it is the husband who's dead." "But I tell you he was with me only a few hours ago," cried the Sultan angrily. "I must get to the bottom of this before I sleep. Let my golden coach be brought round at once." The coach was before the door in another 5 minutes, and the Sultan and the Sultana both got in. Abu Nawas had ceased being a dead man, and was looking to the street when he saw the coach coming. "Quick, quick!" he called to his wife. "The Sultan will be here directly, and we must both be there to receive him." So they laid themselves down and spread the sheet over them, and held their breath. At that instant the Sultan entered, followed by the Sultana and the Chamberlain, and he went up to the bed and found the corpses stiff and motionless. "I would give 1,000 gold pieces to anyone who would tell me the truth about this," cried he, and at those words Abu Nawas sat up. "Give them to me, then," said he, holding out his hand. "You cannot give them to anyone who needs them more." "Oh, Abu Nawas, you impudent dog!" exclaimed the Sultan, bursting into a laugh, in which the Sultana joined. "I might have known it was one of your tricks." But he sent Abu Nawas the gold he had promised, and let us hope that it did not fly so fast as the last had done. End of The Death of Abu Nawas and of his Wife. Recording by Imagine.
Chapter 26 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Ferreira. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 26. Moti Katika. Once upon a time, in a very hot country, a man lived with his wife in a little hut, which was surrounded by grass and flowers. They were perfectly happy together, till, by and by, the woman fell ill and refused to take any food. The husband tried to persuade her to eat all sorts of delicious fruits that he had found in the forest, but she would have none of them, and grew so thin he feared she would die. "Is there nothing you would like?" he said at last in despair. "Yes, I think I could eat some wild honey," answered she. The husband was overjoyed, for he thought this sounded easy enough to get, and he went off at once in search of it. He came back with a wooden pan quite full, and gave it to his wife. "I can't eat that," she said, turning away in disgust. "Look, there are some dead bees in it. I want honey that is quite pure." And the man threw the rejected honey on the grass, and started off to get some fresh. When he got back he offered it to his wife, who treated it as she had done the first bowlful. "That honey has got ants in it, throw it away," she said, and when he brought her some more she declared it was full of earth. In the fourth journey he managed to find some that she would eat, and then she begged him to get her some water. This took him some time, but at length he came to a lake whose waters were sweetened with sugar. He filled a pannikin quite full, and carried it home to his wife, who drank it eagerly, and said that she now felt quite well. When she was up and had dressed herself, her husband lay down in her place, saying, "You have given me a great deal of trouble, and now it is my turn." "What is the matter with you?" asked the wife. "I am thirsty and want some water," answered he. And she took a large pot and carried it to the nearest spring, which was a good way off. "Here is the water," she said to her husband, lifting the heavy pot from her head, but he turned away in disgust. "You have drawn it from the pool that is full of frogs and willows. You must get me some more." So the woman set out again and walked still further to another lake. "This water tastes of rushes," he exclaimed. "Go and get some fresh." But when she brought back a third supply he declared that it seemed made up of water lilies, and that he must have water that was pure and not spoilt by willows or frogs or rushes. So for the fourth time she put the jug on her head, and passing all the lakes she had hitherto tried, she came to another where the water was golden like honey. She stooped down to drink, when a horrible head bobbed up on the surface. "How dare you steal my water?" cried the head. "It is my husband who has sent me," she replied, trembling all over. "But do not kill me. You shall have my baby if you will only let me go." "How am I to know which is your baby?" asked the ogre. "Oh, that is easily managed. I will shave both sides of his head, and hang some white beads round his neck, and when you come to the hut you have only to call 'Moti Katika,' and he will run to meet you, and you can eat him." "Very well," said the ogre, "you can go home." and after filling the pot she returned and told her husband of the dreadful danger she had been in. Now, though his mother did not know it, the baby was a magician, and he had heard all that his mother had promised the ogre, and he laughed to himself as he planned how to outwit her. The next morning she shaved his head on both sides, and hung the white beads round his neck, and said to him, "I am going to the fields to work, but you must stay at home. Be sure you do not go outside, or some wild beast may eat you." "Very well," answered he. As soon as the mother was out of sight the baby took out some magic bones, and placed them in a row before him. "You are my father," he told one bone, "and you are my mother. You are the biggest," he said to the third, "so you shall be the ogre who wants to eat me, and you," to another, "are very little, therefore you shall be me. Now, then, tell me what I am to do." "Collect all the babies in the village the same size as yourself," answered the bones. "Shave the sides of their heads, and hang white beads round their necks, and tell them that when anyone calls, 'Motikatika,' they are to answer to it, and be quick, for you have no time to lose." Motikatika went out directly, and brought back quite a crowd of babies, and shaved their heads, and hung white beads round their little black necks, and just as he had finished the ground began to shake, and the huge ogre came striding along, crying, "Motikatika! Motikatika!" "Here we are," answered the babies, all running to meet him. "It is Motikatika I want," said the ogre. "We are all Motikatika," they replied. And the ogre sat down in bewilderment, for he dared not eat the children of people who had done him no wrong, or a heavy punishment would befall him. The children waited for a little, wondering, and then they went away. The ogre remained where he was till the evening, when the woman returned from the fields. "I have not seen Motikatika," said he. "But why did you not call him by his name, as I told you?" she asked. "I did, but all the babies in the village seem to be named Motikatika," answered the ogre. "You cannot think the number who came running to me." The woman did not know what to make of it, so, to keep him in a good temper, she entered the hut and prepared a bowl of maize, which she brought him. "I do not want maize, I want the baby," grumbled he, "and I will have him." "Have patience," answered she, "I will call him, and you can eat him at once." And she went out into the hut and cried, "Motikatika!" "I'm coming, mother," replied he. But first he took out his bones, and crouching down on the ground behind the hut, asked them how he should escape the ogre. "Change yourself into a mouse," said the bones. And so he did, and the ogre grew tired of waiting, and told the woman she must invent some other plan. "Tomorrow I will send him into the field to pick some beans for me, and you will find him there, and can eat him." "Very well," replied the ogre, "and this time I will take care to have him," and he went back to his lake. Next morning Motikatika was sent out with a basket, and told to pick some beans for dinner. On the way to the field he took out his bones, and asked them what he was to do to escape from the ogre. "Change yourself into a bird and snap off the beans," said the bones. And the ogre chased away the bird, not knowing that it was Motikatika. The ogre went back to the hut and told the woman that she had deceived him again, and that he would not be put off any longer. "Return here this evening," answered she, "and you will find him in bed under this white coverlet. Then you can carry him away and eat him at once." But the boy heard, and consulted his bones, which said, "Take the red coverlet from your father's bed, and put yours on his." And so he did. And when the ogre came he seized Motikatika's father, and carried him outside the hut and ate him. When his wife found out the mistake she cried bitterly, but Motikatika said, "It is only just that he should be eaten, and not I, for it was he and not I who sent you to fetch the water." Adapted from the Bauranga. H. Janad. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Patrick Reinhardt. The Crimson Fairy Book. Edited by Andrew Lang. Niels and the Giants. On one of the great moors over in Jutland, where trees won't grow because the soil is so sandy and the wind so strong, there once lived a man and his wife, who had a little house and some sheep, and 2 sons who helped them to herd them. The elder of the 2 was called Rasmus, and the younger Niels. Rasmus was quite content to look after sheep, as his father had done before him, but Niels had a fancy to be a hunter, and was not happy till he got hold of a gun and learned to shoot. It was only an old muzzle-loading flintlock after all, but Niels thought it a great prize, and went about shooting at everything he could see. So much did he practice that in the long run he became a wonderful shot, and was heard of even where he had never been seen. Some people said there was very little in him beyond this, but that was an idea they found reason to change in the course of time. The parents of Rasmus and Niels were good Catholics, and when they were getting old the mother took it into her head that she would like to go to Rome and see the Pope. The others didn't see much use in this, but she had her way in the end. They sold all the sheep, shut up the house, and set out for Rome on foot. Niels took his gun with him. "What do you want with that?" said Rasmus. "We have plenty to carry without it." But Niels could not be happy without his gun, and took it all the same. It was in the hottest part of summer that they began their journey, so hot that they could not travel at all in the middle of the day, and they were afraid to do it by night lest they might lose their way or fall into the hands of robbers. One day, a little before sunset, they came to an inn which lay at the edge of a forest. "We had better stay here for the night," said Rasmus. "What an idea!" said Niels, who was growing impatient at the slow progress they were making. "We can't travel by day for the heat, and we remain where we are all night. It will be long enough before we get to Rome if we go on at this rate." Rasmus was unwilling to go on, but the two old people sided with Niels, who said, "The nights aren't dark, and the moon will soon be up. We can ask at the inn here, and find out which way we ought to take." So they held on for some time, but at last they came to a small opening in the forest, and here they found that the road split in two. There was no signpost to direct them, and the people in the inn had not told them which of the two roads to take. "What's to be done now?" said Rasmus. "I think we had better have stayed at the inn." "There's no harm done," said Niels. "The night is warm, and we can wait here till morning. One of us will keep watch till midnight, and then waken the other." Rasmus chose to take the first watch, and the others lay down to sleep. It was very quiet in the forest, and Rasmus could hear the deer and the foxes and other animals moving about among the rustling leaves. After the moon rose, he could see them occasionally, and when a big star came quite close to him, he got hold of Niels' gun and shot it. Niels was wakened by the report. "What's that?" he said. "I've just shot a stag," said Rasmus, highly pleased with himself. "That's nothing," said Niels. "I've often shot a sparrow, which is a much more difficult thing to do." It was now close on midnight, so Niels began his watch, and Rasmus went to sleep. It began to get colder, and Niels began to walk about a little to keep himself warm. He soon found that they were not far from the edge of the forest, and when he climbed up one of the trees, there he could see out over the open country beyond. At a little distance he saw a fire, and beside it there sat 3 giants, busy with broth and beef. They were so huge that the spoons they used were as large as spades, and their forks as big as hay forks. With these they lifted whole bucketfuls of broth and great joints of meat out of an enormous pot, which was set on the ground between them. Niels was startled and rather scared at first, but he comforted himself with the thought that the giants were a good way off, and that if they came nearer he could easily hide among the bushes. After watching them for a little, however, he began to get over his alarm, and finally slid down the tree again, resolved to get his gun and play some tricks with them. When he had climbed back to his former position, he took good aim, and waited till one of the giants was just in the act of putting a large piece of meat into his mouth. Bang! Went Niels' gun, and the bullet struck the handle of the fork so hard that the point went into the giant's chin instead of his mouth. "None of your tricks!" growled the giant to the one who sat next him. "What do you mean by hitting my fork like that, and making me prick myself?" "I never touched your fork," said the other. "Don't try to get up a quarrel with me." "Look at it, then," said the first. "Do you suppose I stuck it into my own chin for fun?" The two got so angry over the matter that each offered to fight the other there and then, but the third giant acted as peacemaker, and they again fell to their eating. While the quarrel was going on, Niels had loaded the gun again, and just as the second giant was about to put a nice titbit into his mouth, bang went the gun again, and the fork flew into a dozen pieces. This giant was even more furious than the first had been, and the words were just coming to blows, when the third giant again interposed. "Don't be fools," he said to them. "What's the good of beginning to fight among yourselves when it is so necessary for the three of us to work together and get the upper hand over the king of this country? It will be a hard enough task as it is, but it will be altogether hopeless if we don't stick together. Sit down again and let us finish our meal. I shall sit between you, and then neither of you can blame the other." Niels was too far away to hear their talk, but from their gestures he could guess what was happening, and thought it good fun. "Thrice is lucky," said he to himself. "I'll have another shot yet." This time it was the third giant's fork that caught the bullet, and snapped in two. "Well," said he, "if I were as foolish as you two, I would also fly into a rage, but I begin to see what time of day it is, and I'm going off this minute to see who it is that's playing these tricks with us." So well had the giant made his observations, that though Niels climbed down the tree as fast as he could, so as to hide among the bushes, he had just got to the ground when the enemy was upon him. "Stay where you are," said the giant, "or I'll put my foot on you, and there won't be much of you left after that." Niels gave in, and the giant carried him back to his comrades. "You don't deserve any mercy at our hands," said his captor, "but as you are such a good shot, you may be of great use to us, so we shall spare your life, if you will do us a service. Not far from here there stands a castle in which the king's daughter lives. We are at war with the king, and want to get the upper hand of him by carrying off the princess. But the castle is so well guarded that there is no getting into it. By our skill in magic we have cast sleep on every living thing in the castle, except a little black dog, and as long as he is awake we are no better off than before. For as soon as we begin to climb over the wall, the little dog will hear us, and its barking will waken all the others again. Having got you, we can place you where you will be able to shoot the dog before it begins to bark, and then no one can hinder us from getting the princess into our hands. If you do that, we shall not only let you off, but reward you handsomely." Niels had to consent, and the giants set out for the castle at once. It was surrounded by a very high rampart, so high that even the giants could not touch the top of it. "How am I to get over that?" said Niels. "Quite easily," said the third giant. "I'll throw you up on it." "No thanks," said Niels. "I might fall down on the other side, or break my leg or neck, and then the little dog wouldn't get shot after all." "No fear of that," said the giant. "The rampart is quite wide on the top, and covered with long grass, so that you will come down as softly as though you fell on a feather bed." Niels had to believe him, and allowed the giant to throw him up. He came down on his feet quite unhurt, but the little black dog heard the dump, and rushed out of its kennel at once. It was just opening its mouth to bark, when Niels fired, and it fell dead on the spot. "Go down on the inside now," said the giant, "and see if you can open the gate to us." Niels made his way down into the courtyard, but on his way to the outer gate he found himself at the entrance to the large hall of the castle. The door was open, and the hall was brilliantly lighted, though there was no one to be seen. Niels went in here and looked round him. On the wall there hung a huge sword without a sheath, and beneath it was a large drinking horn, mounted with silver. Niels went closer to look at these, and saw that the horn had letters engraved on the silver rim. When he took it down and turned it round, he found that the inscription was, "Whoever drinks the wine I hold can wield the sword that hangs above. Then let him use it for the right, and win a royal maiden's love." Niels took out the silver stopper of the horn, and drank some of the wine, but when he tried to take down the sword he found himself unable to move it. So he hung up the horn again, and went further into the castle. "The giants can wait a little," he said. Before long he came to an apartment in which a beautiful princess lay asleep in a bed, and on a table by her side there lay a gold-hemmed handkerchief. Niels tore this in two, and put one half in his pocket, leaving the other half on the table. On the floor he saw a pair of gold-embroidered slippers, and one of these he also put in his pocket. After that he went back to the hall, and took down the horn again. "Perhaps I have to drink all that is in it before I can move the sword," he thought. So he put it to his lips again, and drank till it was quite empty. When he had done this, he could wield the sword with the greatest of ease, and felt himself strong enough to do anything, even to fight the giants he had left outside, who were, no doubt, wondering why he had not opened the gate to them before this time. To kill the giants, he thought, would be using the sword for the right. But as to winning the love of the princess, that was a thing which the son of a poor sheep farmer need not hope for. When Niels came to the gate of the castle, he found that there was a large door and a small one, so he opened the latter. "Can't you open the big door?" said the giants. "We shall hardly be able to get in at this one." "The bars are too heavy for me to draw," said Niels. "If you stoop a little you can quite well come in here." The first giant accordingly bent down and entered in a stooping posture, but before he had time to straighten his back again, Niels made a sweep with the sword, and off went the giant's head. To push the body aside as it fell was quite easy for Niels, so strong had the wine made him, and the second giant, as he entered, met the same reception. The third was slower in coming, so Niels called out to him. "Be quick," he said. "You are surely the oldest of the three, since you are so slow in your movements, but I can't wait here long. I must get back to my own people as soon as possible." So the third also came in, and was served in the same way. It appears from the story that giants were not given fair play. By this time day was beginning to break, and Niels thought that his folks might already be searching for him, so instead of waiting to see what took place at the castle, he ran off to the forest as fast as he could, taking the sword with him. He found the others still asleep, so he woke them up, and they again set out on their journey. Of the night's adventures he said not a word, and when they asked him where he got the sword, he only pointed in the direction of the castle and said, "Over that way." They thought he had found it, and asked no more questions. When Niels left the castle, he shut the door behind him, and it closed with such a bang that the porter woke up. He could scarcely believe his eyes when he saw the three headless giants lying in a heap in the courtyard, and could not imagine what had taken place. The whole castle was soon aroused, and then everybody wondered at the affair. It was soon seen that the bodies were those of the king's great enemies, but how they came to be there, and in that condition, was a perfect mystery. Then it was noticed that the drinking horn was empty and the sword gone, while the princess reported that half of her handkerchief and one of her slippers had been taken away. How the giants had been killed seemed a little clearer now, but who had done it was as great a puzzle as before. The old king, who had charge of the castle, said that in his opinion it must have been some young knight, who had immediately set off to the king to claim the hand of the princess. This sounded likely, but the messenger who was sent to the court returned with the news that no one there knew anything about the matter. "We must find him, however," said the princess, "for if he is willing to marry me I cannot in honour refuse him, after what my father put on the horn." She took counsel with her father's wisest men as to what ought to be done, and among other things they advised her to build a house beside the highway, and put over the door this inscription: "Whoever will tell the story of his life may stay here 3 nights for nothing." This was done, and many strange tales were told to the princess, but none of the travellers said a word about the three giants. In the meantime Niels and the others tramped on towards Rome. Autumn passed, and winter was just beginning when they came to the foot of a great range of mountains, towering up to the sky. "Must we go over these?" said they. "We shall be frozen to death or buried in the snow." "Here comes a man," said Niels. "Let us ask him the way to Rome." They did so, and were told that there was no other way. "And is it far yet?" said the old people, who were beginning to be worn out by the long journey. The man held up his foot so that they could see the sole of his shoe. It was worn as thin as paper, and there was a hole in the middle of it. "These shoes were quite new when I left Rome," he said, "and look at them now. That will tell you whether you're far from it or not." This discouraged the old people so much that they gave up all thought of finishing the journey, and only wished to get back to Denmark as quickly as they could. What with the winter and bad roads, they took longer to return than they had taken to go, but in the end they found themselves in sight of the forest where they had slept before. "What's this?" said Rasmus. "Here's a big house built since we passed this way before." "So it is," said Niels. "Let's stay all night in it." "No, we can't afford that," said the people. "It will be too dear for the like of us." However, when they saw what was written above the door, they were all well pleased to get a night's lodging for nothing. They were well received, and had so much attention given to them that the old people were quite put out by it. After they had got time to rest themselves, the princess's steward came to hear their story. "You saw what was written above the door," he said to the father. "Tell me who you are, and what your history has been." "Dear me, I have nothing of any importance to tell you," said the old man, "and I am sure we should never have made so bold as to trouble you at all, if it hadn't been for the youngest of our two sons here." "Never mind that," said the steward. "You are very welcome if you will only tell me the story of your life." "Well, well, I will," said he, "but there's nothing to tell about it. I and my wife have lived all our days on a moor in North Jutland until this last year, when she took a fancy to go to Rome. We set out with our two sons, but turned back long before we got there, and are now on our way home again. That's all my own story, and our two sons have lived with us all their days, so there is nothing more to be told about them either." "Yes, there is," said Rasmus. "When we were on our way south, we slept in the wood near here one night, and I shot a stag." The steward was so much accustomed to hearing stories of no importance that he thought there was no use going further with this, but reported to the princess that the newcomers had nothing to tell. "Did you question them all?" she said. "Well, no, not directly," said he, "but the father said that none of them could tell me any more than he had done." "You are getting careless," said the princess. "I shall go and talk to them myself." Niels knew the princess again as soon as she entered the room, and was greatly alarmed, for he immediately supposed that all this was a device to discover the person who had run away with the sword, the slipper, and the half of the handkerchief, and that it would fare badly with him if he were discovered. So he told his story much the same as the others did. Niels was not very particular, and thought he had escaped all further trouble, when Rasmus put in his word. "You've forgotten something, Niels," he said. "You remember you found a sword near here that night I shot the stag." "Where is the sword?" said the princess. "I know," said the steward. "I saw where he laid it down when they came in." And off he went to fetch it, while Niels wondered whether he could make his escape in the meantime. Before he had made up his mind, however, the steward was back with the sword, which the princess recognized at once. "Where did you get this?" she said to Niels. Niels was silent, and wondered what the usual penalty was for a poor sheep farmer's son who was so unfortunate as to deliver a princess and carry off things from her bedroom. "See what else he has about him," said the princess to the steward, and Niels had to submit to be searched. Out of one pocket came a gold-embroidered slipper, and out of another the half of a gold-hemmed handkerchief. "That is enough," said the princess. "Now we needn't ask any more questions. Send for my father, the king, at once." "Please let me go," said Niels. "I did you as much good as harm, at any rate." "Why, who said anything about doing harm?" said the princess. "You must stay here till my father comes." The way in which the princess smiled when she said this gave Niels some hope that things might not be bad for him after all, and he was yet more encouraged when he thought of the words engraved on the horn, though the last line still seemed too good to be true. However, the arrival of the king soon settled the matter. The princess was willing, and so was Niels, and in a few days the wedding bells were ringing. Niels was made an earl by that time, and looked as handsome as any of them when dressed in all his robes. Before long the old king died, and Niels reigned after him. But whether his father and mother stayed with him, or went back to the moor in Jutland, or were sent to Rome in a carriage and four, is something that all the historians of his reign have forgotten to mention. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Patrick Reinhardt. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Shepherd Paul. Once upon a time a shepherd was taking his flock out to pasture, when he found a little baby lying in a meadow, left there by some wicked person, who thought it was too much trouble to look after it. The shepherd was fond of children, so he took the baby home with him, and gave it plenty of milk, and by the time the boy was 14 he could tear up oaks as if they were weeds. Then Paul, as the shepherd had called him, grew tired of living at home, and went out into the world to try his luck. He walked on for many miles, seeing nothing that surprised him, but in an open space of the wood he was astonished at finding a man combing trees as another man would comb flax. "Good morning, friend," said Paul. "Upon my word, you must be a strong man." The man stopped his work and laughed. "I am Tree Comber," he answered proudly, "and the greatest wish of my life is to wrestle with Shepherd Paul." "May all your wishes be fulfilled as easily, for I am Shepherd Paul, and can wrestle with you at once," replied the lad, and he seized Tree Comber and flung him with such force to the ground that he sank up to his knees in the earth. However, in a moment he was up again, and catching hold of Paul, threw him so that he sank up to his waist. But then it was Paul's turn again, and this time the man was buried up to his neck. "That is enough," cried he. "I see you are a smart fellow. Let us become friends." "Very good," answered Paul, and they continued their journey together. By and by they reached a man who was grinding stones to powder in his hands, as if they had been nuts. "Good morning," said Paul politely. "Upon my word, you must be a strong fellow." "I am Stone Crusher," answered the man, "and the greatest wish of my life is to wrestle with Shepherd Paul." "May all your wishes be as easily fulfilled, for I am Shepherd Paul, and will wrestle with you at once." And the sport began. After a short time the man declared himself beaten, and begged leave to go with him, so they all three travelled together. A little further on they came upon a man who was kneading iron as if it had been dough. "Good morning," said Paul. "You must be a strong fellow." "I am Iron Kneader, and should like to fight Shepherd Paul," answered he. "Let us begin at once, then," replied Paul, and on this occasion also Paul got the better of his foe, and they all four continued their journey. At midday they entered a forest, and Paul stopped suddenly. "We three will go and look for game," he said, "and you, Tree Comber, will stay behind and prepare a good supper for us." So Tree Comber set to work to boil and roast, and when dinner was nearly ready a little dwarf with a pointed beard strolled up to the place. "What are you cooking?" asked he. "Give me some of it." "I'll give you some on your back if you like," answered Tree Comber rudely. The dwarf took no notice, but waited patiently till the dinner was cooked. Then suddenly throwing Tree Comber on the ground, he ate up the contents of the saucepan and vanished. Tree Comber felt rather ashamed of himself, and set about boiling some more vegetables, but they were still very hard when the hunters returned, and though they complained of his bad cooking, he did not tell them about the dwarf. Next day Stone Crusher was left behind, and after him Iron Kneader, and each time the dwarf appeared, and they fared no better than Tree Comber had done. The fourth day Paul said to them, "My friends, there must be some reason why your cooking has always been so bad. Now you shall go and hunt, and I will stay behind." So they went off, amusing themselves by thinking what was in store for Paul. He set to work at once, and had just got all his vegetables simmering in the pot when the dwarf appeared as before, and asked to have some of the stew. "Be off!" cried Paul, snatching up the saucepan as he spoke. The dwarf tried to get hold of his collar, but Paul seized him by the beard and tied him to a big tree so that he could not stir, and went on quietly with his cooking. The hunters came back early, longing to see how Paul had got on, and to their surprise dinner was quite ready for them. "You are great useless creatures," said he, "who couldn't even outwit that little dwarf. When we have finished supper I will show you what I have done with him." But when they reached the place where Paul had left the dwarf, neither he nor the tree was to be seen, for the little fellow had pulled it up by the roots and run away, dragging it after him. The four friends followed the track of the tree, and found that it ended in a deep hole. "He must have gone down here," said Paul, "and I will go after him. See, there is a basket that will do for me to sit in, and a cord to lower me with. But when I pull the cord again, lose no time in drawing the basket up." And he stepped into the basket, which was lowered by his friends. At last it touched the ground, and he jumped out and looked about him. He was in a beautiful valley, full of meadows and streams, with a splendid castle standing by. As the door was open he walked in, but a lovely maiden met him and implored him to go back, for the owner of the castle was a dragon with 6 heads, who had stolen her from her home and brought her down to this underground spot. But Paul refused to listen to all her entreaties, and declared that he was not afraid of the dragon, and did not care how many heads he had, and he sat down calmly to wait for him. In a little while the dragon came in, and all the long teeth in his 6 heads chattered with anger at the sight of the stranger. "I am Shepherd Paul," said the young man, "and I have come to fight you, and as I am in a hurry we had better begin at once." "Very good," answered the dragon. "I am sure of my supper, but let us have a mouthful of something first, just to give us an appetite." Whereupon he began to eat some huge boulders as if they had been cakes, and when he had quite finished, he offered Paul one. Paul was not fond of boulders, but he took a wooden knife and cut one in two, then he snatched up both halves in his hands and threw them with all his strength at the dragon, so that 2 out of the 6 heads were smashed in. At this the dragon, with a mighty roar, rushed upon Paul, but he sprang on one side, and with a swinging blow cut off 2 of the other heads. Then seizing the monster by the neck, he dashed the remaining heads against the rock. When the maiden heard that the dragon was dead, she thanked her deliverer with tears in her eyes, but told him that her two younger sisters were in the power of dragons still fiercer and more horrible than this one. He vowed that his sword should never rest in its sheath till they were set free, and bade the girl come with him and show him the way. The maiden gladly consented to go with him, but first she gave him a golden rod, and bade him strike the castle with it. He did so, and it instantly changed into a golden apple, which he put in his pocket. After that they started on their search. They had not gone far before they reached the castle where the second girl was confined by the power of the dragon with 12 heads, who had stolen her from her home. She was overjoyed at the sight of her sister and of Paul, and brought him a shirt belonging to the dragon, which made everyone who wore it twice as strong as they were before. Scarcely had he put it on when the dragon came back, and the fight began. Long and hard was the struggle, but Paul's sword and his shirt helped him, and the 12 heads lay dead upon the ground. Then Paul changed the castle into an apple, which he put into his pocket, and set out with the 2 girls in search of the third castle. It was not long before they found it, and within the walls was the third sister, who was younger and prettier than either of the other 2. Her husband had 18 heads, but when he quitted the lower regions for the surface of the earth, he left them all at home except one, which he changed for the head of a little dwarf with a pointed beard. The moment that Paul knew that this terrible dragon was no other than the dwarf whom he had tied to the tree, he longed more than ever to fly at his throat. But the thought of the 18 heads warned him to be careful, and the third sister brought him a silk shirt, which would make him 10 times stronger than he was before. He had scarcely put it on when the whole castle began to shake violently, and the dragon flew up the steps into the hall. "Well, my friend, so we meet once more. Have you forgotten me? I am Shepherd Paul, and I have come to wrestle with you, and to free your wife from your clutches." "Ah, I am glad to see you again," said the dragon. "Those were my 2 brothers whom you killed, and now your blood shall pay for them." And he went into his room to look for his shirt, and to drink some magic wine. But the shirt was on Paul's back, and as for the wine, the girl had given a cupful to Paul, and then had allowed the rest to run out of the cask. At this the dragon grew rather frightened, but in a moment had recollected his 18 heads, and was bold again. "Come on!" he cried, rearing himself up, and preparing to dart all his heads at once at Paul. But Paul jumped underneath, and gave an upward cut, so that 6 of the heads went rolling down. They were the best heads, too, and very soon the other 12 lay beside them. Then Paul changed the castle into an apple, and put it in his pocket. Afterwards he and the 3 girls set off for the opening which led upwards to the earth. The basket was still there, dangling from the rope, but it was only big enough to hold the 3 girls, so Paul sent them up, and told them to be sure and let down the basket for him. Unluckily, at the sight of the maiden's beauty, so far beyond anything they had ever seen, the friends forgot all about Paul, and carried the girls straight away into a far country, so that they were not much better off than before. Mad with rage, the ingratitude of the 3 sisters vowed he would be revenged upon them, and set about finding some way of getting back to earth. But it was not very easy, and for months and months and months he wandered about underground, and at the end seemed no nearer to fulfilling his purpose than he was at the beginning. At length, one day, he happened to pass the nest of a huge griffin who had left her young ones all alone. Just as Paul came along, a cloud containing fire instead of rain burst overhead, and all the little griffins would certainly have been killed had not Paul spread his cloak over the nest and saved them. When their father returned, the young ones told him what Paul had done, and he lost no time in flying after Paul, and asking how he could reward him for his goodness. "By carrying me up to the earth," answered Paul, and the griffin agreed, but first went to get some food to eat on the way, as it was a long journey. "Now get on my back," he said to Paul, "and when I turn my head to the right, cut a slice off the bullock that hangs on that side, and put it in my mouth, and when I turn my head to the left, draw a cupful of wine from the cask that hangs on that side, and pour it down my throat." For 3 days and 3 nights Paul and the griffin flew upwards, and on the 4th morning it touched the ground just outside the city where Paul's friends had gone to live. Then Paul thanked him and bade him farewell, and he returned home again. At first Paul was too tired to do anything but sleep, but as soon as he was rested he started off in search of the 3 faithless ones, who almost died from fright at the sight of him, for they had thought he would never come back to reproach them for their wickedness. "You know what to expect," Paul said to them quietly. "You shall never see me again. Off with you!" He next took the 3 apples out of his pocket, and placed them all in the prettiest places he could find, after which he tapped them with his golden rod, and they became castles again. He gave 2 of the castles to the eldest sisters, and kept the other for himself and the youngest, whom he married, and there they are living still. End of Chapter 28. Shepherd Paul.
Chapter 29 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 29. How the Wicked Tanuki Was Punished. The hunters had hunted the wood for so many years that no wild animal was any more to be found in it. You might walk from one end to the other without ever seeing a hare, or a deer, or a boar, or hearing the cooing of the doves in their nest. If they were not dead, they had flown elsewhere. Only 3 creatures remained alive, and they had hidden themselves in the thickest part of the forest, high up in the mountain. These were the gray-furred, long-tailed tanuki, his wife the fox, who was one of his own family, and their little son. The fox and the tanuki were very clever, prudent beasts, and they also were skilled in magic, and by this means had escaped the fate of their unfortunate friends. If they heard the twang of an arrow, or saw the glitter of a spear ever so far off, they lay very still, and were not to be tempted from their hiding place, if their hunger was ever so great, or the game ever so delicious. "We are not foolish as to risk our lives," they said to each other proudly. But at length there came a day when, in spite of their prudence, they seemed likely to die of starvation, for no more food was to be had. Something had to be done, but they did not know what. Suddenly a bright thought struck the tanuki. "I've got a plan," he cried joyfully to his wife. "I will pretend to be dead, and you must change yourself into a man and take me to the village for sale. It will be easy to find a buyer. Tanuki skins are always wanted. Then buy some food with the money and come home again. I will manage to escape somehow, so do not worry about me." The fox laughed with delight and rubbed her paws together with satisfaction. "Well, next time I will go," she said, "and you can sell me." And then she changed herself into a man, and picking up the stiff body of the tanuki, set off towards the village. She found him rather heavy, but it would never have done to let him walk through the wood and risk his being seen by somebody. As the tanuki had foretold, buyers were many, and the fox handed him over to the person who offered the largest price, and hurried to get some food with the money. The buyer took the tanuki back to his house, and throwing him into a corner, went out. Directly the tanuki found he was alone, he crept cautiously through a chink in the window, thinking, as he did so, how lucky it was that he was not a fox, and was able to climb. Once outside, he hid himself in a ditch till it grew dusk, and then galloped away into the forest. While the food lasted, they were all 3 as happy as kings. But there soon arrived the day when the larder was as empty as ever. "It is my turn now to pretend to be dead," cried the fox. So the tanuki changed himself into a peasant, and started for the village with his wife's body hanging over his shoulder. A buyer was not long in coming forward, and while they were making the bargain a wicked thought darted into the tanuki's mind, that if he got rid of the fox there would be more food for him and his son. So, as he put the money in his pocket, he whispered softly to the buyer that the fox was not really dead, and that if he did not take care she might run away from him. The man did not need twice telling. He gave the poor fox a blow on the head which put an end to her, and the wicked tanuki went smiling to the nearest shop. In the former times he had been very fond of his little son, but since he had betrayed his wife he seemed to have changed all in a moment, for he would not give him as much as a bite, and the poor little fellow would have starved had he not found nuts and berries to eat, and he waited on, always hoping that his mother would come back. At length some notion of the truth began to dawn on him, but he was careful to let the old tanuki see nothing, though in his own mind he turned over plans from morning till night, wondering how best he might avenge his mother. One morning, as the little tanuki was sitting with his father, he remembered with a start that his mother had taught him all she knew of magic, and that he could work spells as well as his father, or perhaps better. "I am as good a wizard as you," he said suddenly, and a cold chill ran through the tanuki as he heard him, though he laughed and pretended to think it a joke. But the little tanuki stuck to his point, and at last the father proposed they should have a wager. "Change yourself into any shape you like," said he, "and I will undertake to know you. I will go and wait on the bridge which leads over the river to the village, and you shall transform yourself into anything you please, but I will know you through any disguise." The little tanuki agreed, and went down the road which his father had pointed out. But instead of transforming himself into a different shape, he just hid himself in a corner of the bridge, where he could see without being seen. He had not been there long when his father arrived and took up his place near the middle of the bridge, and soon after the king came by, followed by a troop of guards and all of his court. "Ah, he thinks that now he has changed himself into a king I shall not know him," thought the old tanuki, and as the king passed in his splendid carriage borne by his servants, he jumped upon it crying, "I have won my wager, you cannot deceive me." But in reality it was he who had deceived himself. The soldiers, conceiving that their king was being attacked, seized the tanuki by the legs and flung him over into the river, and the water closed over him. And the little tanuki saw it all and rejoiced that his mother's death had been avenged. Then he went back to the forest, and if he has not found it too lonely, he is probably living there still. From Japanische Märchen. End of How the Wicked Tanuki Was Punished. Recording by Ellie. July 2010.
Chapter 30 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bree. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 30. The Crab and the Monkey. There once was a crab who lived in a hole on the shady side of a mountain. She was a very good housewife, and so careful and industrious that there was no creature in the whole country whose hole was so neat and clean as hers, and she took great pride in it. One day she saw lying near the mouth of her hole a handful of cooked rice, which some pilgrim must have let fall when he was stopping to eat his dinner. Delighted at this discovery, she hastened to the spot, and was carrying the rice back to her hole, when a monkey, who lived in some trees near by, came down to see what the crab was doing. His eyes shone at the sight of the rice, for it was his favorite food, and, like the sly fellow he was, he proposed a bargain to the crab. She was to give him half the rice in exchange for the kernel of a sweet red cocky fruit which he had just eaten. He half expected that the crab would laugh in his face at this impudent proposal, but instead of doing so, she only looked at him for a moment with her head on one side, and then said that she would agree to the exchange. So the monkey went off with his rice, and the crab returned to her hole with the kernel. For some time the crab saw no more of the monkey, who had gone to pay a visit on the sunny side of the mountain. But one morning he happened to pass by her hole, and found her sitting under the shadow of a beautiful kaki tree. "Good day," he said politely. "You have some very fine fruit there. I am very hungry. Could you spare me one or two?" "Oh, certainly," replied the crab. "But you must forgive me if I cannot get them for you myself. I am no tree climber." "Pray do not apologize," answered the monkey. "Now that I have your permission, I can get them myself quite easily." And the crab consented to let him go up, merely saying that he must throw her down half the fruit. In another moment he was swinging himself from branch to branch, eating all the ripest cockies and filling his pockets with the rest, and the poor crab saw to her disgust that the few he threw down to her were either not ripe at all, or else quite rotten. "You are a shocking rogue!" she called in a rage, but the monkey took no notice, and went on eating as fast as he could. The crab understood that it was no use her scolding, so she resolved to try what cunning would do. "Sir Monkey," she said, "you are certainly a very good climber, but now that you have eaten so much, I am quite sure you would never be able to turn one of your somersaults." The monkey prided himself on turning better somersaults than any of his family, so instantly went head over heels 3 times on the bough on which he was sitting, and all the beautiful cockies that he had in his pockets rolled to the ground. Quick as lightning the crab picked them up and carried a quantity of them into her house, but when she came up for another the monkey sprang on her and treated her so badly that he left her for dead. When he had beaten her till his arm ached, he went his way. It was a lucky thing for the poor crab that she had some friends to come to her help, or she certainly would have died then and there. The wasp flew to her and took her back to bed and looked after her, and then he consulted with a rice mortar and an egg which had fallen out of a nest near by, and they agreed that when the monkey returned, as he was sure to do, to steal the rest of the fruit, that they would punish him severely for the manner in which he had behaved to the crab. So the mortar climbed up to the beam over the front door, and the egg lay quite still on the ground, while the wasp set down the water bucket in a corner. Then the crab dug itself a deep hole in the ground, so that not even the tip of her claws might be seen. Soon after everything was ready, the monkey jumped down from his tree, and, creeping to the door, began a long hypocritical speech, asking pardon for all he had done. He waited for an answer of some sort, but none came. He listened, but all was still. Then he peeped, and saw no one. Then he went in. He peered about for the crab, but in vain. However, his eyes fell on the egg, which he snatched up and set on the fire. But in a moment the egg had burst into 1,000 pieces, and its sharp shell struck him in the face and scratched him horribly. Smarting with the pain, he ran to the bucket and stooped down to throw some water over his head. As he stretched out his hand, up started the wasp and stung him on the nose. The monkey shrieked and ran to the door, but as he passed through, down fell the mortar and struck him dead. After that the crab lived happily for many years, and at length died in peace under her own cocky tree. End of chapter 30. The Crab and the Monkey. Recording by Bree, Richmond, Virginia.
Chapter 31 of the Crimson Fairy Book.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Recording by Jefferson Montoya. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 31. The Horse Gulfaxi and the Sword Goonfodder. Many, many years ago there lived a king and queen who had only one son, called Sigurd. When the little boy was only 10 years old, the queen, his mother, fell ill and died, and the king, who loved her dearly, built a splendid monument to his wife's memory. And day after day he sat by it and bewailed his sad loss. One morning, as he sat by the grave, he noticed a richly dressed lady close to him. He asked her name, and she answered that it was Ingiborg, and seemed surprised to see the king there all alone. Then he told her how he had lost his queen, and how he came daily to weep at her grave. In return, the lady informed him that she had lately lost her husband, and suggested they might both find it a comfort if they made friends. This pleased the king so much that he invited her to his palace, where they saw each other often, and after a time he married her. After the wedding was over, he soon regained his good spirits and used to ride out hunting as in old days, but Sigurd, who was very fond of his stepmother, always stayed at home with her. One evening Ingiborg said to Sigurd, "Tomorrow your father is going out hunting, and you must go with him." But Sigurd said he would much rather stay at home, and the next day when the king rode off, Sigurd refused to accompany him. The stepmother was very angry, but he would not listen, and at last she assured him that he would be sorry for his disobedience, and that in future he had better do as he was told. After the hunting party had started, she hid Sigurd under her bed, and bade him be sure to lie there till she called him. Sigurd lay very still for a long while, and was just thinking it was no good staying there any more, when he felt the floor shake under him as if there were an earthquake, and peeping out he saw a great giantess wading along ankle deep through the ground and ploughing it up as she walked. "Good morning, sister Ingiborg," cried she as she entered the room. "Is Prince Sigurd at home?" "No," said Ingiborg. "He rode off to the forest with his father this morning." And she laid the table for her sister and set food before her. After they had both done eating, the giantess said, "Thank you, sister, for your good dinner. The best lamb, the best can of beer, and the best drink I have ever had. But is not Prince Sigurd at home?" Ingiborg again said no, and the giantess took leave of her and went away. When she was quite out of sight, Ingiborg told Sigurd to come out of his hiding place. The king returned home at night, but his wife told him nothing of what had happened, and the next morning she again begged the prince to go hunting with his father. Sigurd, however, replied as before that he would much rather stay at home. So once more the king rode off alone. This time Ingiborg hid Sigurd under the table and scolded him well for not doing as she bade him. For some time he lay quite still, and then suddenly the floor began to shake, and a giantess came along, wading halfway to her knees through the ground. As she entered the house, she asked, as the first had done, "Well, sister Ingiborg, is Prince Sigurd at home?" "No," answered Ingiborg. "He rode off hunting with his father this morning," and going to the cupboard, she laid the table for her sister. When they had finished their meal, the giantess rose and said, "Thank you for all these nice dishes, and for the best lamb, the best can of beer, and the nicest drink I've ever had, but is Prince Sigurd really not at home?" "No, certainly not," replied Ingiborg, and with that they took leave of each other. When she was well out of sight, Sigurd crept from under the table, and his stepmother declared that it was most important that he should not stay at home the next day, but he said he did not see what harm could come of it, and he did not mean to go out hunting. And the next morning, when the king prepared to start, Ingiborg implored Sigurd to accompany his father. But it was all no use. He was quite obstinate and would not listen to a word she said. "You will have to hide me again," said he. So no sooner had the king gone than Ingiborg hid Sigurd between the wall and the paneling. And by there was heard once more a sound like an earthquake, as a great giantess, wading knee-deep through the ground, came in at the door. "Good day, sister Ingiborg," she cried in a voice like thunder. "Is Prince Sigurd at home?" "Oh no," answered Ingiborg. "He is enjoying himself out there in the forest. I expect it will be quite dark before he comes back again." "That's a lie!" shouted the giantess, and they squabbled about it till they were tired. After which Ingiborg laid the table, and when the giantess had done eating, she said, "Well, I must thank you for all these good things, and for the best lamb, the best can of beer, and the best drink I have had for a long time. But "Are you quite sure Prince Sigurd is not at home?" "Quite," said Ingiborg. "I've told you already that he rode off with his father this morning to hunt in the forest." At this the giantess roared out with a terrible voice, "If he is near enough to hear my words, I lay this spell upon him. Let him be half scorched and half withered, and may he neither have rest nor peace until he finds me." And with these words she stalked off. For a moment Ingiborg stood as if turned to stone. Then she fetched Sigurd from his hiding place, and to her horror there he was, half scorched and half withered. "Now you see what has happened through your own obstinacy," she said. "But we must lose no time, for your father will soon be coming home." Going quickly into the next room, she opened a chest and took out a ball of string and 3 gold rings, and gave them to Sigurd, saying, "If you throw this ball on the ground, it will roll along till it reaches some high cliffs. There you will see a giantess looking out over the rocks. She will call down to you and say, 'Ah, this is just what I wanted. Here is Prince Sigurd. He shall go into the pot tonight.' But don't be frightened by her. She will draw you up with a long boat hook, and you must greet her from me and give her the smallest ring as a present. This will please her, and she will ask you to wrestle with her. When you are exhausted, she will offer you a horn to drink out of, and though she does not know it, the wine will make you so strong that you will easily be able to conquer her. After that, she will let you stay there all night. The same thing will happen with my 2 other sisters. But above all, remember this: should my little dog come to you and lay his paws on you with tears running down his face, then hurry home, for my life will be in danger. Now, good-bye, and don't forget your stepmother." Then Ingiborg dropped the ball on the ground, and Sigurd bade her farewell. That same evening the ball stopped rolling at the foot of some high rocks, and on glancing up, Sigurd saw the giantess looking out at the top. "Ah, just what I wanted!" she cried out when she saw him. "Here is Prince Sigurd. He shall go into the pot tonight. Come up, my friend, and wrestle with me." With these words she reached out a long boat hook and hauled him up the cliff. At first Sigurd was rather frightened, but he remembered what Ingiborg had said and gave the giantess her sister's message and the ring. The giantess was delighted and challenged him to wrestle with her. Sigurd was fond of all games and began to wrestle with joy, but he was no match for the giantess, and as she noticed that he was getting faint, she gave him a horn to drink out of, which was very foolish on her part, as it made Sigurd so strong that soon he overthrew her. "You may stay here tonight," she said, and he was glad of the rest. Next morning Sigurd threw down the ball again, and away it rolled for some time, till it stopped at the foot of another high rock. Then he looked up and saw another giantess, even bigger and uglier than the first one, who called out to him, "Ah, this is just what I wanted! Here is Prince Sigurd. He shall go into the pot tonight. Come up quickly and wrestle with me." And she lost no time hauling him up. The prince gave her his stepmother's message and the second largest ring. The giantess was greatly pleased when she saw the ring, and at once challenged Sigurd to wrestle with her. They struggled for a long time, till at last Sigurd grew faint. So she handed him a horn to drink from, and when he had drunk he became so strong that he threw her down with one hand. On the 3rd morning Sigurd once more laid down his ball, and it rolled far away, till at last it stopped under a very high rock indeed, over the top of which the most hideous giantess that ever was seen looked down. When she saw who was there, she cried out, "Ah, this is just what I wanted! Here comes Prince Sigurd. Into the pot he goes this very night. Come up here, my friend, and wrestle with me." And she hauled him up just as her sisters had done. Sigurd then gave her his stepmother's message and the last and largest ring. The sight of the red gold delighted the giantess, and she challenged Sigurd to a wrestling match. This time the fight was fierce and long, but when at length Sigurd's strength was failing, the giantess gave him something to drink, and after he had drunk it, he soon brought her to her knees. "You have beaten me," she gasped. "So now listen to me. Not far from here is a lake. Go there and you will find a little girl playing with a boat. Try to make friends with her and give her this little gold ring. You're stronger than you ever were, and I wish you good luck." With these words they took leave of each other, and Sigurd wandered on till he reached the lake, where he found the little girl playing with a boat, just as he'd been told. He went up to her and asked what her name was. She was called Helga, she answered, and she lived nearby. So Sigurd gave her the little gold ring and proposed that they should have a game. The little girl was delighted, for she had no brothers or sisters, and they played together all the rest of the day. When evening came, Sigurd asked leave to go home with her, but Helga at first forbade him, as no stranger had ever managed to enter their house without being found out by her father, who was a very fierce giant. However, Sigurd persisted, and at length she gave way. But when they came near the door, she held her glove over him, and Sigurd was at once transformed into a bundle of wool. Helga took the bundle under her arm and threw it on the bed in her room. At almost the same moment her father rushed in and hunted around in every corner, crying out, "This place smells of men! What's that you threw on the bed, Helga?" "A bundle of wool," she said. "Oh, well, perhaps it was that I smelt," said the old man, and troubled himself no more. The following day Helga went out to play and took the bundle of wool with her under her arm. When she reached the lake, she held her glove over it again, and Sigurd resumed his own shape. They played the whole day, and Sigurd taught Helga all sorts of games she had never even heard of. As they walked home in the evening, she said, "We shall be able to play better still tomorrow, for my father will have to go to the town, so we can stay at home." When they were near the house, Helga again held her glove over Sigurd, and once more he was turned into a bundle of wool, and she carried him in without his being seen. The very next morning Helga's father went to the town, and as soon as he was well out of the way, the girl held up her glove and Sigurd was himself again. Then she took him all over the house to amuse him, and opened every room, for her father had given her the keys before he left. But when they came to the last room, Sigurd noticed one key on the bunch which had not been used, and asked which room it belonged to. Helga grew red and did not answer. "I suppose you don't mind my seeing the room which it opens?" asked Sigurd, and as he spoke he saw a heavy iron door, and begged Helga to unlock it for him. But she told him she dared not do so. At least if she did open the door it must only be a very tiny chink, and Sigurd declared that that would do quite well. The door was so heavy that it took Helga some time to open it, and Sigurd grew so impatient that he pushed it wide open and walked in. There he saw a splendid horse, already saddled, and just above it hung a richly ornamented sword, on the handle of which was engraved these words, "He who rides this horse and wears this sword will find happiness." At the sight of the horse, Sigurd was so filled with wonder that he was not able to speak, but at last he gasped out, "Oh, do let me mount him and ride him around the house. Just once, I promise not to ask any more." "Ride him around the house!" cried Helga, growing pale at the mere idea. "Ride Gullfaxi! Why, father would never, never forgive me if I let you do that." "But it can't do him any harm," argued Sigurd. "You don't know how careful I will be. I've ridden all sorts of horses at home, and have never fallen off, not once. Oh, Helga, do!" "Well, perhaps, if you come back directly," replied Helga, doubtfully. "But you must be very quick, or father will find out." But instead of mounting Gullfaxi, as she expected, Sigurd stood still. "And the sword," he said, looking fondly up at the place where it hung. "My father is a king, but he has not got any sword as beautiful as that. Why, the jewels in the scabbard are more splendid than the big ruby in his crown. Has it got a name? Some swords have, you know." "It is called Gunfjotr," "The battle plume," answered Helga, "and Gullfaxi means golden mane." "I don't suppose, if you are to get on the horse at all, it would matter your taking the sword too. And if you take the sword, you'll have to carry the stick and the stone and the twig as well." "They are easily carried," said Sigurd, gazing at them with scorn. "What wretched dried up things! Why in the world do you keep them?" "Father says that he would rather lose Gullfaxi than lose them," replied Helga. "For if the man who rides the horse is pursued, he has only to throw the twig behind him, and it will turn into a forest so thick that even a bird could hardly fly through. But if his enemy happens to know magic and can throw down the forest, the man has only to strike the stone with the stick, and hailstones as large as pigeons' eggs will rain down from the sky and will kill everyone for 20 miles around." Having said all this, she allowed Sigurd to ride just once round the house, taking the sword and the other things with him. But when he had ridden round, instead of dismounting, he suddenly turned the horse's head and galloped away. Soon after this Helga's father came home and found his daughter in tears. He asked what was the matter, and when he heard all that had happened, he rushed off as fast as he could to pursue Sigurd. Now, as Sigurd happened to look behind him, he saw the giant coming after him with great strides, and in all haste he threw the twig behind him. Immediately such a thick wood sprang up at once between him and his enemy, and the giant was obliged to run home for an axe with which to cut his way through. Next time Sigurd glanced around, the giant was so near that he almost touched Gullfaxi's tail. In an agony of fear, Sigurd turned quickly in his saddle and hit the stone with the stick. No sooner had he done this than a terrible hailstorm burst behind, and the giant was killed on the spot. But had Sigurd struck the stone without turning around, the hail would have driven right into his face and killed him instead. After the giant was dead, Sigurd rode on towards his home, and on the way he suddenly met his stepmother's little dog running to meet him, with tears pouring down its face. He galloped as hard as he could, and on arriving found 9 men servants in the act of tying Queen Ingeborg to a post in the courtyard of the palace, where they intended to burn her. Wild with anger, Prince Sigurd sprang from his horse, and, sword in hand, fell on the men and killed them all. Then he released his stepmother and went in with her to see his father. The king lay in bed, sick with sorrow, and neither eating nor drinking, for he thought his son had been killed by the queen. He could hardly believe his own eyes for joy when he saw the prince, and Sigurd told him all his adventures. After that Prince Sigurd rode back to fetch Helga, and a great feast was made, which lasted 3 days, and everyone said no bride was ever seen so beautiful as Helga, and they lived happily for many, many years, and everybody loved them. From Icelandish Märchen. End of chapter 31. Recording by Jefferson Montoya. Las Vegas, Nevada. Recorded in August 2011.
Chapter 32 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Patrick Reinhardt. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. The Story of the Sham Prince, or the Ambitious Tailor. Once upon a time there lived a respectable young tailor called Labakan, who worked for a clever master in Alexandria. No one could call Labakan either stupid or lazy, for he could work extremely well and quickly, when he chose, but there was something not altogether right about him. Sometimes he would stitch away as fast as if he had a red-hot needle and a burning thread, and at other times he would sit lost in thought, and with such a queer look about him that his fellow workmen used to say, "Labakan has got on his aristocratic face today." On Fridays he would put on his fine robe which he had bought with the money he had managed to save up, and go to the mosque. As he came back after prayers, if he met any friend who said "Good day," or "How are you, friend Labakan?" he would wave his hand graciously or nod in a condescending way, and if his master happened to say to him, as he sometimes did, "Really, Labakan, you look like a prince," he was delighted, and would answer, "Have you noticed it too?" or, "Well, so I have long thought." Things went on like this for some time, and the master put up with Labakan's absurdities because he was, on the whole, a good fellow and a clever workman. One day the Sultan's brother happened to be passing through Alexandria and wanted to have one of his state robes altered, so he sent for the master tailor, who handed the robe over to Labakan as his best workman. In the evening, when every one had left the workshop and gone home, a great longing drove Labakan back to the place where the royal robe hung. He stood a long time gazing at it, admiring the rich material and the splendid embroidery in it. At last he could hold out no longer. He felt he must try it on, and lo and behold! It fitted as though it had been made for him. "Am not I as good a prince as any other?" he asked himself, as he proudly paced up and down the room. "Has not the master often said that I seemed born to be a prince?" It seemed to him that he must be the son of some unknown monarch, and at last he determined to set out at once and travel in search of his proper rank. He felt as if the splendid robe had been sent him by some kind fairy, and he took care not to neglect such a precious gift. He collected all his savings, and, concealed by the darkness of the night, he passed through the gates of Alexandria. The new prince excited a good deal of curiosity wherever he went, for his splendid robe and majestic manner did not seem quite suitable to a person traveling on foot. If anyone asked questions, he only replied with an important air of mystery that he had his own reasons for not riding. However, he soon found out that walking made him ridiculous, so at last he bought a quiet, steady old horse, which he managed to get cheap. One day, as he was ambling along upon Murva, that was the horse's name, a horseman overtook him and asked leave to join him, so that they might both beguile the journey with pleasant talk. The newcomer was a bright, cheerful, good-looking young man, who soon plunged into conversation and asked many questions. He told Labakan that his own name was Omar, that he was a nephew of Elfi Bey, and was travelling in order to carry out a command given him by his uncle on his deathbed. Labakan was not quite so open in his confidences, but hinted that he too was of noble birth, and was travelling for pleasure. The two young men took a fancy to each other and rode on together. On the second day of their journey, Labakan questioned Omar as to the orders he had to carry out, and to his surprise heard this tale. Elfi Bey, Pacha of Cairo, had brought up Omar from his earliest childhood, and the boy had never known his parents. On his deathbed Elfi Bey called Omar to him, and then told him that he was not his nephew, but the son of a great king, who, having been warned of coming dangers by his astrologers, had sent the young prince away and made a vow not to see him till his 22nd birthday. Elfi Bey did not tell Omar his father's name, but expressly desired him to be at a great pillar 4 days' journey east of Alexandria, on the 4th day of the coming month, on which day he would be 22 years old. Here he would meet some men, to whom he was to hand a dagger which Elfi Bey gave him, and to say, Here am I for whom you seek." If they answered, "Praised be the Prophet who has preserved you," he was to follow them, and they would take him to his father. Labakan was greatly surprised and interested by this story, but after hearing it, he could not help looking on Prince Omar with envious eyes, angry that his friend should have the position he himself longed so much for. He began to make comparisons between the prince and himself, and was obliged to confess that he was a fine-looking young man, with very good manners and a pleasant expression. At the same time he felt sure that had he been in the prince's place, any royal father might have been glad to own him. These thoughts haunted him all day, and he dreamt them all night. He woke very early, and as he saw Omar sleeping quietly, with a happy smile on his face, a wish arose in his mind to take by force or by cunning the things which an unkind fate had denied him. The dagger which was to act as a passport was sticking in Omar's girdle. Labakan drew it gently out, and hesitated for a moment whether or not to plunge it into the heart of the sleeping prince. However, he shrank from the idea of murder, so he contented himself with placing the dagger in his own belt, and, saddling Omar's swift horse for himself, was many miles away before the prince woke up to realize his losses. For 2 days Labakan rode on steadily, fearing lest, after all, Omar might reach the meeting place before him. At the end of the second day he saw the great pillar at a distance. It stood on a little hill in the middle of a plain, and could be seen a very long way off. Labakan's heart beat fast at the sight. Though he had had some time in which to think over the part he meant to play, his conscience made him rather uneasy. However, the thought that he must certainly have been born to be a king supported him, and he bravely rode on. The neighbourhood was quite bare and desert, and it was a good thing that the new prince had brought food for some time with him, as 2 days were still wanting till the appointed time. Towards the middle of the next day he saw a long procession of horses and camels coming towards him. It halted at the bottom of the hill, and some splendid tents were pitched. Everything looked like the escort of some great man. Labakan made a shrewd guess that all these people had come here on his account. But he checked his impatience, knowing that only on the 4th day could his wishes be fulfilled. The first rays of the rising sun woke the happy tailor. As he began to saddle his horse and prepare to ride to the pillar, he could not help having some remorseful thoughts of the trick he had played, and the blighted hopes of the real prince. But the die was cast, and his vanity whispered that he was as fine-looking a young man as the proudest king might wish his son to be, and that, moreover, what had happened had happened. With these thoughts he summoned up all his courage, sprang on his horse, and in less than a quarter of an hour was at the foot of the hill. Here he dismounted, tied the horse to a bush, and, drawing out Prince Omar's dagger, climbed up the hill. At the foot of the pillar stood 6 men round a tall and stately person. His superb robe of cloth of gold was girt round him by a white cashmere shawl, and his white, richly jewelled turban showed that he was a man of wealth and high rank. Labakan went straight up to him, and, bending low, handed him the dagger, saying, "Here am I whom you seek." "Praised be the Prophet who has preserved you," replied the old man with tears of joy. "Embrace me, my dear son Omar." The proud tailor was deeply moved by these solemn words, and with mingled shame and joy sank into the old king's arms. But his happiness was not long unclouded. As he raised his head he saw a horseman who seemed trying to urge a tired or unwilling horse across the plain. Only too soon Labakan recognized his own old horse, Merva, and the real Prince Omar, but having once told a lie he made up his mind not to own his deceit. At last the horseman reached the foot of the hill. Here he flung himself from the saddle and hurried up to the pillar. "Stop!" he cried, "whoever you may be, and do not let a disgraceful impostor take you in. My name is Omar, and let no one attempt to rob me of it." This turn of affairs threw the standers-by into great surprise. The old king in particular seemed much moved, as he looked from one face to the other. At last Labakan spoke with forced calmness. "Most gracious lord and father, do not let yourself be deceived by this man. As far as I know, he is a half-crazy tailor's apprentice from Alexandria, called Labakan, who really deserves more pity than anger." These words infuriated the prince. Foaming with rage, he tried to press towards Labakan, but the attendants threw themselves upon him and held him fast, whilst the king said, "Truly, my dear son, the poor fellow is quite mad. Let him be bound and placed on a dromedary. Perhaps we may be able to get some help for him." The prince's first rage was over, and with tears he cried to the king, "My heart tells me that you are my father, and in my mother's name I entreat you to hear me." "Oh, heaven forbid!" was the reply. "He is talking nonsense again. How can the poor man have got such notions into his head?" With these words the king took Labakan's arm to support him down the hill. They both mounted richly caparisoned horses and rode across the plain at the head of their followers. The unlucky prince was tied hand and foot and fastened on a dromedary, a guard riding on either side and keeping a sharp lookout on him. The old king was Sached, Sultan of the Wachabites. For many years he had had no children, but at length the son he had so long wished for was born. But the soothsayers and magicians whom he consulted as to the child's future all said that until he was 22 years old he stood in danger of being injured by an enemy. So to make all safe, the Sultan had confided the prince to his trusty friend Elfi Bey, and deprived himself of the happiness of seeing him for 22 years. All this the Sultan told Labakan, and was much pleased by his appearance and dignified manner. When they reached their own country they were received with every sign of joy, for the news of the prince's safe return had spread like wildfire, and every town and village was decorated, whilst the inhabitants thronged to greet them with cries of joy and thankfulness. All this filled Labakan's proud heart with rapture, whilst the unfortunate Omar followed in silent rage and despair. At length they arrived in the capital, where the public rejoicings were grander and more brilliant than anywhere else. The queen awaited them in the great hall of the palace, surrounded by her entire court. It was getting dark, and hundreds of coloured hanging lamps were lit to turn night into day. The brightest hung round the throne on which the queen sat, and which stood above 4 steps of pure gold inlaid with great amethysts. The 4 greatest nobles in the kingdom held a canopy of crimson silk over the queen, and the Sheikh of Medina fanned her with a peacock feather fan. In this state she awaited her husband and her son, She too had not seen Omar since his birth, but so many dreams had shown her what he would look like that she felt she would know him among 1,000. And now the sound of trumpets and drums and of shouts and cheers outside announced the long-looked-for moment. The doors flew open, and between rows of low-bending courtiers and servants the king approached the throne, leading his pretended son by the hand. "Here," said he, "is he for whom you have been longing for so many years." But the queen interrupted him. "That is not my son," she cried. "That is not the face the prophet has shown me in my dreams." Just as the king was about to reason with her, the door was thrown violently open, and Prince Omar rushed in, followed by his keepers, whom he had managed to get away from. He flung himself down before the throne, panting out, "Here will I die! Kill me at once, cruel father, for I cannot bear the shame any longer." Everyone pressed round the unhappy man, and the guards were about to seize him when the queen, who at first was dumb with surprise, sprang up from her throne. "Hold!" cried she. "This and no other is the right one. This is the one whom my eyes have never yet seen, but whom my heart recognizes." The guards had stepped back, but the king called to them in a furious voice to secure the madman. "It is I who must judge," he said in tones of command, "and this matter cannot be decided by women's dreams, but by certain unmistakable signs. This one," pointing to Labakan, "is my son, for it was he who brought me the token from my friend Elfi, the dagger." "He stole it from me!" shrieked Omar. "He betrayed my unsuspicious confidence." But the king would not listen to his son's voice, for he had always been accustomed to depend on his own judgment. He let the unhappy Omar be dragged from the hall, whilst he himself retired with Labakan to his own rooms. Full of anger with the queen his wife, in spite of their many years of happy life together. The queen, on her side, was plunged in grief, for she felt certain that an impostor had won her husband's heart, and taken the place of her real son. When the first shock was over, she began to think how she could manage to convince the king of his mistake. Of course, it would be a difficult matter, as the man who declared he was Omar had produced the dagger as a token, besides talking of all sorts of things which happened when he was a child. She called her oldest and wisest ladies about her and asked their advice, but none of them had any to give. At last one very clever old woman said, "Did not the young man who brought the dagger call him whom your majesty believes to be your son Labakan, and say he was a crazy tailor?" "Yes," replied the queen, "but what of that?" "Might it not be," said the old lady, "that the impostor has called your real son by his own name? If this should be the case, I know of a capital way to find out the truth." And she whispered some words to the queen, who seemed much pleased, and went off at once to see the king. Now the queen was a very wise woman, so she pretended to think she might have made a mistake, and only begged to be allowed to put a test to the two young men to prove which was the real prince. The king, who was feeling much ashamed of the rage he had been in with his dear wife, consented at once, and she said, "No doubt others would make them ride or shoot, or something of that sort, but everyone learns these things. I wish to set them a task which requires sharp wits and clever hands, and I want them to try which of them can best make a caftan and pair of trousers." The king laughed. "No, no, that will never do. Do you suppose my son would compete with that crazy tailor as to which could make the best clothes? Oh dear, no, that won't do at all." But the queen claimed his promise, and as he was a man of his word, the king gave in at last. He went to his son and begged that he would humour his mother, who had set her heart on his making a caftan. The worthy Labakan laughed to himself. "If that is all she wants," thought he, "her Majesty will soon be pleased to own me." 2 rooms were prepared, with pieces of material, scissors, needles, and threads, and each young man was shut up in one of them. The king felt rather curious as to what sort of garment his son would make, and the queen too was very anxious as to the result of her experiment. On the 3rd day they sent for the 2 young men and their work. Labakan came first and spread out his caftan before the eyes of the astonished king. "See, father," he said, "see, my honoured mother, if this is not a masterpiece of work. I'll bet the court tailor himself cannot do better." The queen smiled, and turned to Omar. "And what have you done, my son?" Impatiently he threw the stuff and scissors down on the floor. "I have been taught how to manage a horse, to draw a sword, and to throw a lance some 60 paces. But I never learnt to sew, and such a thing would have been thought beneath the notice of the pupil of Elfi Bey, the ruler of Cairo." "Ah, true son of your father!" cried the queen. "If only I might embrace you and call you son! Forgive me, my lord and husband," she added, turning to the king, "for trying to find out the truth in this way. Do you not see yourself now which is the prince and which the tailor? Certainly this caftan is a very fine one, but I should like to know what master taught this young man how to make clothes." The king sat deep in thought, looking now at his wife and now at Labakan, who was doing his best to hide his vexation at his own stupidity. At last the king said, "Even this trial does not satisfy me, but happily I know of a sure way to discover whether or not I have been deceived." He ordered his swiftest horse to be saddled, mounted, and rode off alone into a forest at some little distance. Here lived a kindly fairy called Adolzaide, who had often helped the kings of his race with her good advice, and to her he betook himself. In the middle of the forest was a wide open space surrounded by great cedar trees, and this was supposed to be the fairy's favourite spot. When the king reached this place he dismounted, tied his horse to the tree, and standing in the middle of the open place said, "If it is true that you have helped my ancestors in their time of need, do not despise their descendant, but give me counsel, for that of men has failed me." He had hardly finished speaking when one of the cedar trees opened, and a veiled figure all dressed in white stepped from it. "I know your errand, King Sached," she said. "It is an honest one, and I will give you my help. Take these 2 little boxes, and let the 2 men who claim to be your son choose between them. I know that the real prince will make no mistake." She then handed him 2 little boxes made of ivory set with gold and pearls. On the lid of each, which the king vainly tried to open, was an inscription in diamonds. On one stood the words "Honor and Glory," and on the other "Wealth and Happiness." "It would be a hard choice," thought the king as he rode home. He lost no time in sending for the queen and for all his court, and when all were assembled he made a sign, and Labakan was led in. With a proud air he walked up to the throne, and, kneeling down, asked, "What does my lord and father command?" The king replied, "My son, doubts have been thrown on your claim to that name. One of these boxes contains the proofs of your birth. Choose for yourself. No doubt you will choose right." He then pointed to the ivory boxes, which were placed on two little tables near the throne. Labakan rose and looked at the boxes. He thought for some minutes, and then said, "My honored father, what can be better than the happiness of being your son, and what nobler than the riches of your love? I choose the box with the words, 'Wealth and Happiness.' We shall see presently if you have chosen the right one. For the present, take a seat there beside the Pacha of Medina," replied the king. Omar was next led in, looking sad and sorrowful. He threw himself down before the throne and asked what was the king's pleasure. The king pointed out the two boxes to him, and he rose and went to the tables. He carefully read the two mottos and said, "The last few days have shown me how uncertain is happiness, and how easily riches vanish away. Should I lose a crown by it, I make my choice of honor and glory." He laid his hand on the box as he spoke, but the king signed to him to wait, and ordered Labakan to come to the other table, and lay his hand on the box he had chosen. Then the king rose from his throne, and in solemn silence all present rose too, whilst he said, "Open the boxes, and may Allah show us the truth." The boxes were opened with the greatest ease. In the one Omar had chosen lay a little gold crown and scepter on a velvet cushion. In Labakan's box was found a large needle with some thread. The king told the two young men to bring him their boxes. They did so. He took the crown in his hand, and as he held it, it grew bigger and bigger, till it was as large as a real crown. He placed it on the head of his son Omar, kissed him on the forehead, and placed him on his right hand. Then turning to Labakan, he said, "There's an old proverb, 'The cobbler sticks to his last.' It seems as though you were to stick to your needle. You have not deserved any mercy, but I cannot be harsh on this day. I give you your life, but I advise you to leave this country as fast as you can." Full of shame, the unlucky tailor could not answer. He flung himself down before Omar, and with tears in his eyes asked, "Can you forgive me, prince?" "Go in peace," said Omar as he raised him. "Oh, my true son!" cried the king as he clasped the prince in his arms, whilst all the pachas and emirs shouted, "Long live Prince Omar!" In the midst of all the noise and rejoicing, Labakan slipped off with his little box under his arm. He went to the stables, saddled his old horse Murva, and rode out of the gate towards Alexandria. Nothing but the ivory box with its diamond motto was left to show him that the last few weeks had not been a dream. When he reached Alexandria he rode up to his old master's door. When he entered the shop his master came forward to ask what was his pleasure, but as soon as he saw who it was he called his workmen, and they all fell on Labakan with blows and angry words, till at last he fell, half fainting, on a heap of old clothes. The master then scolded him soundly about the stolen robe, but in vain Labakan told him he had come to pay for it, and offered 3 times its price. They only fell to beating him again, and at last pushed him out of the house, more dead than alive. He could do nothing but remount his horse and ride to an inn. Here he found a quiet place in which to rest his bruised and battered limbs, and to think over his many misfortunes. He fell asleep, fully determined to give up trying to be great, but to lead the life of an honest workman. Next morning he set to work to fulfill his good resolutions. He sold his little box to a jeweler for a good price, bought a house and opened a workshop. Then he hung up a sign with "Labakan, Tailor" over his door, and sat down to mend his own torn clothes, with the very needle which had been in the ivory box. After a while he was called away, and when he went back to his work he found a wonderful thing had happened. The needle was sewing away all by itself, and making the neatest little stitches, such as Labakan had never been able to make even at his best. Certainly, even the smallest gift of a kind fairy is of great value, and this one had yet another advantage, for the thread never came to an end, however much the needle sewed. Labakan soon got plenty of customers. He used to cut out the clothes, make the first stitch with the magic needle, and then leave it to do the rest. Before long the whole town went to him, for his work was both so good and so cheap. The only puzzle was how he could do so much, working all alone, and also why he worked with closed doors. And so the promise on the ivory box of wealth and happiness came true for him. And when he heard of all the brave doings of Prince Omar, who was the pride and darling of his people and the terror of his enemies, the ex-prince thought to himself, "After all, I am better off as a tailor, for honor and glory are apt to be very dangerous things." End of The Story of the Sham Prince, or The Ambitious Tailor.
Chapter 33 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jenny Lundak. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 33. The Colony of Cats. Long, long ago, as far back as the time when animals spoke, there lived a community of cats, in a deserted house they had taken possession of not far from a large town. They had everything they could possibly desire for their comfort. They were well fed and well lodged, and if by any chance an unlucky mouse was stupid enough to venture in their way, they caught it, not to eat it, but for the pure pleasure of catching it. The old people of the town related how they had heard their parents speak of a time when the whole country was so overrun with rats and mice that there was not so much as a grain of corn nor an ear of maize to be gathered in the fields. And it might be out of gratitude to the cats who had rid the country of these plagues that their descendants were allowed to live in peace. No one knows where they got the money to pay for everything, nor who paid for it, for this all happened so very long ago. But one thing is certain: they were rich enough to keep a servant. For though they lived very happily together, and did not scratch nor fight more than human beings would have done, They were not clever enough to do the housework themselves, and preferred at all events to have someone to cook their meat, which they would have scorned to eat raw. Not only were they very difficult to please about the housework, but most women quickly tired of living alone with only cats for companions. Consequently they never kept a servant long, and it had become a saying in the town, when anyone found herself reduced to her last penny, "I will go and live with the cats." And so many a poor woman actually did. Now Lizina was not happy at home, for her mother, who was a widow, was much fonder of her elder daughter, so that often the younger one fared very badly, and had not enough to eat, while the elder could have everything she desired. And if Lizina dared to complain she was certain to have a good beating. At last the day came when she was at the end of her courage and patience, and exclaimed to her mother and sister: "As you hate me so much, you will be glad to be rid of me, so I am going to live with the cats." "Be off with you!" cried her mother, seizing an old broom handle from behind the door. Poor Lizina did not wait to be told twice, but ran off at once, and never stopped till she reached the door of the cat's house. Their cook had left them that very morning, with her face all scratched, the result of such a quarrel with the head of the house that he had very nearly scratched out her eyes. Lizina therefore was warmly welcomed, and she set to work at once to prepare the dinner, not without many misgivings as to the tastes of the cats, and whether she would be able to satisfy them. Going to and fro about her work she found herself frequently hindered by a constant succession of cats, who appeared one after another in the kitchen to inspect the new servant. She had one in front of her feet, another perched on the back of her chair while she peeled the vegetables, a third sat on the table beside her, and 5 or 6 others prowled about the pots and pans on the shelves against the wall. The air resounded with their purring, which meant that they were pleased with their new maid, but Lizina had not yet learned to understand their language, and often she did not know what they wanted her to do. However, as she was a good, kind-hearted girl, she set to work to pick up the little kittens which tumbled about the floor. She patched up quarrels, and nursed on her lap a big tabby, the oldest of the community, which had a lame paw. All these kindnesses could hardly fail to make a favourable impression on the cats, and it was even better after a while, when she had had time to grow accustomed to their strange ways. Never had the house been kept so clean, the meats so well served, nor the sick cats so well cared for. After a time they had a visit from an old cat whom they called their father, who lived by himself in a barn at the top of the hill, and came down from time to time to inspect the little colony. He too was much taken with Lizina, and inquired on first seeing her: "Are you well served by this nice black-eyed little person?" And the cats answered with one voice: "Oh yes, Father Gatto, we have never had so good a servant." At each of his visits the answer was always the same, but after a time the old cat, who was very observant, noticed that the little maid had grown to look sadder and sadder. "What is the matter, my child? Has anyone been unkind to you?" he asked one day when he found her crying in the kitchen. She burst into tears, and answered between her sobs: "Oh no, they are all very good to me. but I long for news from home, and I pine to see my mother and my sister." Old Gatto, being a sensible old cat, understood the little servant's feelings. "You shall go home," he said, "and you shall not come back here unless you please. But first you must be rewarded for all your kind services to my children. Follow me down into the inner cellar, where you have never yet been, for I always keep it locked and carry the key away with me." Lizina looked round her in astonishment as they went down into the great vaulted cellar underneath the kitchen. Before her stood the big earthenware water jars, one of which contained oil, the other a liquid shining like gold. "In which of these jars shall I dip you?" asked Father Gatto, with a grin that showed all his sharp white teeth, while his moustaches stood out straight on either side of his face. The little maid looked at the two jars from under her long dark lashes. "In the oil jar," she answered timidly, thinking to herself, "I could not ask to be bathed in gold." But Father Gatto replied, "No, no, you have deserved something better than that," and seizing her in his strong paws he plunged her into the liquid gold. Wonder of wonders! When Lizina came out of the jar she shone from head to foot like the sun in the heavens on a fine summer's day. Her pretty pink cheeks and long black hair alone kept their natural color; otherwise she had become like a statue of pure gold. Father Gatto purred loudly with satisfaction. "Go home," he said, "and see your mother and sisters; but take care, if you hear the cock crow, to turn towards it. If, on the contrary, the ass brays, you must look the other way." The little maid, having gratefully kissed the white paw of the old cat, set off for home; but just as she got near her mother's house the cock crowed, and quickly she turned towards it. Immediately a beautiful golden star appeared on her forehead, crowning her glossy black hair. At the same time the ass began to bray, but Lizina took care not to look over the fence into the field where the donkey was feeding. Her mother and sister, who were in front of their house, uttered cries of admiration and astonishment when they saw her, and their cries became still louder when Lizina, taking her handkerchief out of her pocket, drew out also a handful of gold. For some days the mother and her two daughters lived very happily together, for Lizina had given them everything she had brought away except her golden clothing, for that would not come off, in spite of all the efforts of her sister, who was madly jealous of her good fortune. The golden star, too, could not be removed from her forehead, but all the gold pieces she drew from her pockets had found their way to her mother and sister. "I will go now and see what I can get out of the pussies," said Peppina, the elder girl, one morning, as she took Lizina's basket and fastened her pockets into her own skirt. "I should like some of the cat's gold for myself," she thought, as she left her mother's house before the sun rose. The cat colony had not yet taken another servant, for they knew they could never get one to replace Lizina, whose loss they had not yet ceased to mourn. When they heard that Peppina was her sister they all ran to meet her. "She is not the least like her," the kittens whispered among themselves. "Hush! Be quiet!" the older cat said. "All servants cannot be pretty." No, decidedly she was not at all like Lizina. Even the most reasonable and large-minded of the cats soon acknowledged that. The very first day she shut the kitchen door in the face of the tom cats who used to enjoy watching Lizina at her work. And a young and mischievous cat who jumped in by the open window and alighted on the table got such a blow with the rolling pin that he squalled for an hour. With every day that passed the household became more and more aware of its misfortune. The work was badly done, as the servant was surly and disagreeable. In the corners of the rooms there were collected heaps of dust. Spiders' webs hung from the ceilings and in front of the window panes. The beds were hardly ever made, and the feather beds, so beloved by the old and feeble cats, had never once been shaken since Lizina left the house. At Father Gatto's next visit he found the whole colony in a state of uproar. "Caesar has one paw so badly swollen that it looks as if it were broken," said one. "Peppina kicked him with her great wooden shoes on. Hector has an abscess in his back where a wooden chair was flung at him. And Agrippina's 3 little kittens have died of hunger beside their mother, because Peppina forgot them in their basket up in the attic. There is no putting up with the creature. Do send her away, Father Gatto. Lizina herself would not be angry with us. She must know very well what her sister is like." "Come here," said Father Gatto, in his most severe tones, to Peppina, and he took her down into the cellar and showed her the same 2 great jars that he had showed Lizina. "In which of these shall I dip you?" he asked, and she made haste to answer, "In the liquid gold," for she was no more modest than she was good and kind. Father Gatto's yellow eyes darted fire. "You have not deserved it," he uttered in a voice like thunder, and seizing her he flung her into the jar of oil, where she was nearly suffocated. When she came to the surface screaming and struggling, the vengeful cat seized her again and rolled her in the ash heap on the floor. Then, when she rose, dirty, blinded, and disgusting to behold, he thrust her from the door, saying, "Begone, and when you meet a braying ass be careful to turn your head towards it." Stumbling and raging, Peppina set off for home, thinking herself fortunate to find a stick by the wayside with which to support herself. She was within sight of her mother's house when she heard in the meadow on the right the voice of a donkey loudly braying. Quickly she turned her head towards it, and at the same time put her hand up to her forehead, where, waving like a plume, was a donkey's tail. She ran home to her mother at the top of her speed, yelling with rage and despair. And it took Lizina 2 hours, with a big basin of hot water and 2 cakes of soap, to get rid of the layer of ashes with which Father Gatto had adorned her. As for the donkey's tail, it was impossible to get rid of that. It was as firmly fixed on her forehead as was the golden star on Lizina's. Their mother was furious. She first beat Lizina unmercifully with the broom. Then she took her to the mouth of the well and lowered her into it, leaving her at the bottom weeping and crying for help. Before this happened, however, the king's son, in passing the mother's house, had seen Lizina sitting sewing in the parlour, and had been dazzled by her beauty. After coming back 2 or 3 times, he at last ventured to approach the window and to whisper in the softest voice: "Lovely maiden, will you be my bride?" And she had answered: "I will." Next morning, when the prince arrived to claim his bride, he found her wrapped in a large white veil. "It is so that maidens are received from their parents' hands," said the mother, who hoped to make the king's son marry Peppina in place of her sister, and had fastened the donkey's tail round her head like a lock of hair under the veil. The prince was young and a little timid, so he made no objections, and seated Peppina in the carriage beside him. Their way led past the old house inhabited by cats, who were all at the window, for the report had got about that the prince was going to marry the most beautiful maiden in the world, on whose forehead shone a golden star, and they knew that this could only be their adored Lizina. As the carriage slowly passed in front of the old house, where cats from all parts of the world seemed to be gathered, a song burst from every throat: "Mew, mew, mew, Prince, look behind you. In the well is fair Lizina, and you've got nothing but Peppina." When he heard this, the coachman, who understood the cat's language better than the prince, his master, stopped his horses and asked: "Does your highness know what the grimalkins are saying?" And the song broke forth even louder than ever. With a turn of his hand the prince threw back the veil and discovered the puffed up, swollen face of Peppina, with the donkey's tail twisted round her head. "Ah, traitress!" he exclaimed, and ordering the horses to be turned round, he drove the elder daughter, quivering with rage, to the old woman who had sought to deceive him. With his hand on the hilt of his sword he demanded Lizina in so terrific a voice that the mother hastened to the well to draw her prisoner out. Lizina's clothing and her star shone so brilliantly that when the prince led her home to the king his father, the whole palace was lit up. Next day they were married and lived happily ever after, and all the cats, headed by old Father Gatto, were present at the wedding. Chapter 34. Recording by Jenny Lundak, South Padre Island. Recorded in February 2011.
Chapter 34 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Ferreira. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 34. How to Find Out a True Friend. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who longed to have a son. As none came, one day they made a vow at the shrine of St. James that if their prayers were granted the boy should set out on a pilgrimage as soon as he had passed his 18th birthday. And fancy their delight when one evening the king returned home from hunting and saw a baby lying in the cradle. All the people came crowding round to peep at it, and declared it was the most beautiful baby that ever was seen. Of course, that is what they always say, but this time it happened to be true. And every day the boy grew bigger and stronger till he was 12 years old, when the king died, and he was left alone to take care of his mother. In this way 6 years passed by, and his 18th birthday drew near. When she thought of this, the queen's heart sank within her, for he was the light of her eyes, and how was she going to send him forth to the unknown dangers that beset a pilgrim? So day by day she grew more and more sorrowful, and when she was alone wept bitterly. Now the queen imagined that no one but herself knew how sad she was, but one morning her son said to her, "Mother, why do you cry the whole day long?" "Nothing, nothing, my son. There is only one thing in the world that troubles me." "What is that one thing?" asked he. "Are you afraid your property is badly managed? Let me go and look into the matter." This pleased the queen, and he rode off to the plain country, where his mother owned great estates. But everything was in beautiful order, and he returned with a joyful heart, and said, "Now, mother, you can be happy again, for your lands are better managed than anyone else's I have seen. The cattle are thriving, the fields are thick with corn, and soon they will be ripe for harvest." "This is good news indeed," answered she, but it did not seem to make any difference to her, and the next morning she was weeping and wailing as loudly as ever. "Dear mother," said her son in despair, "if you will not tell me what is the cause of all this misery, I shall leave home and wander far through the world." "Ah, my son," cried the queen, "it is the thought that I must part from you which causes me such grief, for before you were born we vowed a vow to St. James that when your 18th birthday was past you should make a pilgrimage to his shrine, and very soon you will be 18 and I shall lose you, and for a whole year my eyes will never be gladdened by the sight of you, for the shrine is far away." "Will it take no longer than that to reach it?" said he. "Oh, don't be so wretched. It is only dead people who never return. As long as I am alive you may be sure I will come back to you." After this manner he comforted his mother, and on his 18th birthday his best horse was led to the door of the palace, and he took leave of the queen in these words: "Dear mother, farewell, and by the help of fate I shall return to you as soon as I can." The queen burst into tears and wept sore. Then amidst her sobs she drew 3 apples from her pocket and held them out, saying, "My son, take these apples and give heed unto my words. You will need a companion in the long journey on which you are going. If you come across a young man who pleases you, beg him to accompany you, and when you get to an inn invite him to have dinner with you. After you have eaten, cut one of these apples in 2 unequal parts and ask him to take one. If he takes the larger bit, then part from him, for he is no true friend to you. But if he takes the smaller bit, treat him as your brother, and share with him all you have." Then she kissed her son once more, and blessed him, and let him go. The young man rode a long way without meeting a single creature, but at last he saw a youth in the distance about the same age as himself, and he spurred his horse till he came up with a stranger, who stopped and asked, "Where are you going, my fine fellow?" "I am making a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James, for before I was born my mother vowed that I should go forth with a thank offering on my 18th birthday." "That is my case too," said the stranger, "and as we must both travel in the same direction, let us bear each other company." The young man agreed to this proposal, but he took care not to get on terms of familiarity with the newcomer until he had tried him with the apple. By and by they reached an inn, and at sight of it the king's son said, "I am very hungry. Let us enter and order something to eat." The other consented, and they were soon sitting before a good dinner. When they had finished, the king's son drew an apple from his pocket and cut it into a big half and a little half, and offered both to the stranger, who took the biggest bit. "You are no friend of mine," thought the king's son, and in order to part company with him he pretended to be ill and declared himself unable to proceed on his journey. "Well, I can't wait for you," replied the other. "I am in haste to push on, so farewell." "Farewell," said the king's son, glad in his heart to be rid of him so easily. The king's son remained in the inn for some time, so as to let the young man have a good start. Then he ordered his horse and rode after him. But he was very sociable, and the way seemed long and dull by himself. "Oh, if I could only meet with a true friend," he thought, "so that I should have someone to speak to. I hate being alone." Soon after he came up with a young man, who stopped and asked him, "Where are you going, my fine fellow?" The king's son explained the object of his journey, and the young man answered, as the other had done, that he also was fulfilling the vow of his mother made at his birth. "Well, we can ride on together," said the king's son, and the road seemed much shorter now that he had someone to talk to. At length they reached an inn, and the king's son exclaimed, "I am very hungry. Let us go in and get something to eat." When they had finished, the king's son drew an apple out of his pocket and cut it in 2. He held the big bit and the little bit out to his companion, who took the big bit at once and soon ate it up. "You are no friend of mine," thought the king's son, and began to declare that he felt so ill he could not continue his journey. When he had given the young man a good start he set off himself, but the way seemed even longer and duller than before. "Oh, if I could only meet with a true friend, he should be as a brother to me," he sighed sadly. And as the thought passed through his mind he noticed a youth going the same road as himself. The youth came up to him and said, "Which way are you going, my fine fellow?" And for the third time the king's son explained all about his mother's vow. "Why, that is just like me!" cried the youth. "Then let us ride on together," answered the king's son. Now the miles seemed to slip by, for the newcomer was so lively and entertaining that the king's son could not help hoping that he indeed might prove to be the true friend. More quickly than he could have thought possible they reached an inn by the roadside, and turning to his companion the king's son said, I am hungry. Let us go in and have something to eat." So they went in and ordered dinner, and when they had finished the king's son drew out of his pocket the last apple, and cut it into two unequal parts, and held both out to the stranger. And the stranger took the little piece, and the heart of the king's son was glad within him, for at last he had found the friend he had been looking for. "Good youth," he cried, "we will be brothers, and what is mine shall be thine, and what is thine shall be mine, and together we will push on to the shrine, and if one of us dies on the road the other shall carry his body there." And the stranger agreed to all he said, and they rode forward together. It took them a whole year to reach the shrine, and they passed through many different lands on their way. One day they arrived tired and half starved in a big city, and said to one another, "Let us stay here for a little and rest, before we set forth again." So they hired a small house close to the royal castle, and took up their abode there. The following morning the king of the country happened to step on to his balcony, and saw the young men in the garden, and said to himself, "Dear me, those are wonderfully handsome youths, but one is handsomer than the other, and to him will I give my daughter to wife." And indeed the king's son excelled his friend in beauty. In order to set about his plan the king asked both the young men to dinner, and when they arrived at the castle he received them with the utmost kindness, and sent for his daughter, who was more lovely than both the sun and moon put together. But at bedtime the king caused the other young man to be given a poisoned drink, which killed him in a few minutes, for he thought to himself, "If his friend dies the other will forget his pilgrimage, and will stay here and marry my daughter." When the king's son awoke the next morning he inquired of the servants where his friend had gone, as he did not see him. "He died suddenly last night," said they, "and is to be buried immediately." But the king's son sprang up and cried, "If my friend is dead I can stay here no longer, and cannot linger an hour in this house." "Oh, give up your journey and remain here," exclaimed the king, "and you shall have my daughter for your wife." "No," answered the king's son, "I cannot stay, but I pray you grant my request, and give me a good horse, and let me go in peace, and when I have fulfilled my vow then I will return and marry your daughter." So the king, seeing no words would move him, ordered a horse to be brought round, and the king's son mounted it, and took his dead friend before him on the saddle, and rode away. Now the young man was not really dead, but only in a deep sleep. When the king's son reached the shrine of St. James, he got down from his horse, took his friend in his arms as if he had been a child, and laid him before the altar. "St. James," he said, "I have fulfilled the vow my parents made for me. I have come myself to your shrine, and have brought my friend. I place him in your hands. Restore him to life, I pray, for though he be dead yet he has fulfilled his vow also." And behold, while he yet prayed his friend got up and stood before him as well as ever, and both the young men gave thanks, and set their faces towards home. When they arrived at the town where the king dwelt they entered the small house over against the castle. The news of their coming spread very soon, and the king rejoiced greatly that the handsome young prince had come back again, and commanded great feasts to be prepared, for in a few days his daughter should marry the king's son. The young man himself could imagine no greater happiness, and when the marriage was over they spent some months at the court making merry. At length the king's son said, "My mother awaits me at home, full of care and anxiety. Here I must remain no longer, and tomorrow I will take my wife and my friend and start for home." And the king was content that he should do so, and gave orders to prepare for their journey. Now in his heart the king cherished a deadly hate towards the poor young man whom he had tried to kill, but who had returned to him living, and in order to do him hurt sent him on a message to some distant spot. "See that you are quick," said he, "for your friend will await your return before he starts." The youth put spurs to his horse and departed, bidding the prince farewell so that the king's message might be delivered the sooner. As soon as he had started the king went to the chamber of the prince and said to him, "If you do not start immediately you will never reach the place where you must camp for the night." "I cannot start without my friend," replied the king's son. "Oh, he will be back in an hour," replied the king, "and I will give him my best horse, so that he will be sure to catch you up." The king's son allowed himself to be persuaded, and took leave of his father-in-law, and set out with his wife on his journey home. Meanwhile the poor friend had been unable to get through his task in the short time appointed by the king, and when at last he returned the king said to him, "Your comrade is a long way off by now. You had better see if you can overtake him." So the young man bowed and left the king's presence, and followed after his friend on foot, for he had no horse. Night and day he ran, till at length he reached the place where the king's son had pitched his tent, and sank down before him, a miserable object, worn out and covered with mud and dust. But the king's son welcomed him with joy, and tended him as he would his brother. And at last they came home again, and the queen was waiting and watching in the palace, as she had never ceased to do since her son had rode away. She almost died of joy at seeing him again, But after a little she remembered his sick friend, and ordered a bed to be made ready, and the best doctors in all the country to be sent for. When they heard of the queen's summons they flocked from all parts, but none could cure him. After everyone had tried and failed, a servant entered and informed the queen that a strange old man had just knocked at the palace gate and declared that he was able to heal the dying youth. Now this was a holy man who had heard of the trouble the king's son was in, and had come to help. It happened that at this very time a little daughter was born to the king's son, but in his distress for his friend he had barely a thought to spare for the baby. He could not be prevailed on to leave the sick bed, and he was bending over it when the holy man entered the room. "Do you wish your friend to be cured?" asked the newcomer of the king's son, "and what price would you pay?" "What price?" answered the king's son. "Only tell me what I can do to heal him." "Listen to me then," said the old man. "This evening you must take your child, and open her veins, and smear the wounds of your friend with her blood, and you will see, and he will get well in an instant." At these words the king's son shrieked with horror, for he loved the baby dearly, but he answered, "I have sworn that I would treat my friend as if he were my brother, and if there is no other way my child must be sacrificed." As by this time evening had already fallen, he took the child and opened its veins, and smeared the blood over the wounds of the sick man, and the look of death departed from him, and he grew strong and rosy once more. But the little child lay as white and still as if she had been dead. They laid her in the cradle and wept bitterly, for they thought that by the next morning she would be lost to them. At sunrise the old man returned and asked after the sick man. "He is as well as ever," answered the king's son. "And where is your baby?" "In the cradle yonder, and I think she is dead," replied the father sadly. "Look at her once more," said the holy man, and as they drew near the cradle there lay the baby smiling up at them. "I am Saint James of Lycia," said the old man, "and I have come to help you, for I have seen that you are a true friend. From henceforward live happily, all of you, together, and if trouble should draw near to you, send for me, and I will aid you to get through them." With these words he lifted his hand in blessing and vanished. And they obeyed him, and were happy and content, and tried to make the people of the land happy and contented too. From Sicilianische Märchen Ganzenbach. End of chapter 34.
Chapter 35 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 35. Clever Maria. There was once a merchant who lived close to the royal palace and had 3 daughters. They were all pretty, but Maria, the youngest, was the prettiest of the 3. One day the king sent for the merchant, who was a widower, to give him directions about a journey he wished the good man to take. The merchant would rather not have gone, as he did not like leaving his daughters at home, but he could not refuse to obey the king's commands, and with a heavy heart he returned home to say farewell to them. Before he left he took 3 pots of basil and gave one to each girl, saying, "I am going a journey, but I leave these pots. You must let nobody into the house. When I come back they will tell me what has happened." "Nothing will have happened," said the girls. The father went away, and the following day the king, accompanied by 2 friends, paid a visit to the 3 girls, who were sitting at supper. When they saw who was there, Maria said, "Let us go and get a bottle of wine from the cellar. I will carry the key, my eldest sister can take the light, while the other brings the bottle." But the king replied, "Oh, do not trouble, we are not thirsty." "Very well, we will not go," answered the 2 elder girls, but Maria merely said, "I shall go anyhow." She left the room and went to the hall, where she put out the light, and putting down the key and the bottle, ran to the house of a neighbor, and knocked at the door. "Who is there so late?" asked the old woman, thrusting her head out of the window. "Oh, let me in," answered Maria. "I have quarreled with my eldest sister, and as I do not want to fight any more, I have come to beg you to allow me to sleep with you." So the old woman opened the door, and Maria slept in her house. The king was very angry at her for playing truant, but when she returned home the next day she found the plants of her sisters withered away, because they had disobeyed their father. Now the window in the room of the eldest overlooked the gardens of the king, and when she saw how fine and ripe the medlars were on the trees, she longed to eat some, and begged Maria to scramble down by a rope and pick her a few, and she would draw her up again. Maria, who was good natured, swung herself into the garden by the rope and got the medlars, and was just making the rope fast under her arms so as to be hauled up, when her sister cried, "Oh, there are such delicious lemons a little farther on! You might bring me one or two." Maria turned round to pluck them, and found herself face to face with the gardener, who caught hold of her, exclaiming, "What are you doing here, you little thief?" "Don't call me names," she said, "or you will get the worst of it," giving him, as she spoke, such a violent push that he fell panting into the lemon bushes. Then she seized the cord and clambered up to the window. The next day the second sister had a fancy for bananas, and begged so hard that, though Maria had declared she would never do such a thing again, at last she consented, and went down the rope into the king's garden. This time she met the king, who said to her, "Ah, here you are again, cunning one. Now you shall pay for your misdeeds." And he began to cross-question her about what she had done. Maria denied nothing, and when she had finished, the king said again, "Follow me to the house, and there you shall pay the penalty." As he spoke, he started for the house, looking back from time to time to make sure that Maria had not run away. All of a sudden, when he glanced round, he found she had vanished completely, without leaving a trace of where she had gone. Search was made all through the town, and there was not a hole or corner which was not ransacked, but there was no sign of her anywhere. This so enraged the king that he became quite ill, and for many months his life was despaired of. Meanwhile the two elder sisters had married the two friends of the king, and were the mothers of little daughters. Now, one day Maria stole secretly to the house where her elder sister lived, and snatching up the children, put them into a beautiful basket she had with her, covered with flowers inside and out, so that no one would ever guess it held two babies. Then she dressed herself as a boy, and placing the basket on her head, she walked slowly past the palace, crying as she went, "Who will carry these flowers to the king, who lies sick of love?" And the king in his bed heard what she said, and ordered one of his attendants to go out and buy the basket. It was brought to his bedside, and as he raised the lid, cries were heard, and peeping in he saw two little children. He was furious at this new trick, which he felt had been played on him by Maria, and was still looking at them, wondering how he should pay her out, when he was told that the merchant, Maria's father, had finished the business on which he had been sent, and returned home. Then the king remembered how Maria had refused to receive his visit, and how she had stolen his fruit, and he determined to be revenged on her. So he sent a message by one of his pages, that the merchant was to come to see him the next day, and bring with him a coat made of stone, or else he would be punished. Now the poor man had been very sad since he got home the evening before, for though his daughters had promised that nothing should happen while he was away, he had found the two elder ones married without asking his leave. And now there was this fresh misfortune, for how was he to make a coat of stone? He wrung his hands and declared that the king would be the ruin of him, when Maria suddenly entered. "Do not grieve about the coat of stone, dear father, but take this bit of chalk, and go to the palace and say you have come to measure the king." The old man did not see the use of this, but Maria had so often helped him before that he had confidence in her, so he put the chalk in his pocket and went to the palace. "That is no good," said the king, when the merchant had told him what he had come for. "Well, I can't make the coat you want," replied he. "Then if you would save your head, hand over to me your daughter Maria." The merchant did not reply, but went sorrowfully back to his house, where Maria sat waiting for him. "Oh, my dear child, why was I born? The king says that instead of the coat I must deliver you up to him." "Do not be unhappy, dear father, but get a doll made, exactly like me, with a string attached to its head, which I can pull for yes and no." So the old man went out at once to see about it. The king remained patiently in his palace, feeling sure that this time Maria could not escape him, and he said to his pages, "If a gentleman should come here with his daughter and ask to be allowed to speak with me, put the young lady in my room and see she does not leave it." When the door was shut on Maria, who had concealed the doll under her cloak, she hid herself under the couch, keeping fast hold of the string which was fastened to its head. "Señora Maria, I hope you are well," said the king when he entered the room. The doll nodded. "Now we will reckon up accounts," continued he, and he began at the beginning and ended up with the flower basket, and at each fresh misdeed Maria pulled the string, so that the doll's head nodded assent. "Whoso mocks at me merits death," declared the king when he had ended, and drawing his sword cut off the doll's head. It fell towards him, and as he felt the touch of a kiss, he exclaimed, "Ah, Maria, Maria, so sweet in death, so hard to me in life! The man who could kill you deserves to die." And he was about to turn his sword on himself, when the true Maria sprung out from under the bed, and flung herself into his arms. And the next day they were married and lived happily for many years. From the Portuguese. End of chapter 35. Recording by Maria Therese.
Chapter 36 of the Crimson Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jenny Lundak. The Crimson Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Chapter 36. The Magic Kettle. Right in the middle of Japan, high up among the mountains, an old man lived in his little house. He was very proud of it, and never tired of admiring the whiteness of his straw mats, and the pretty papered walls, which in warm weather always slid back so that the smell of the trees and flowers might come in. One day he was standing looking at the mountain opposite, when he heard a kind of rumbling noise in the room behind him. He turned round, and in the corner he beheld a rusty old iron kettle, which could not have seen the light of day for many years. How the kettle got there the old man did not know, but he took it up and looked it over carefully. And when he found that it was quite whole he cleaned the dust off it and carried it into his kitchen. "That was a piece of luck," he said, smiling to himself. "A good kettle costs money, and it is well to have a second one at hand in case of need. Mine is getting worn out, and the water is already beginning to come through its bottom." Then he took the other kettle off the fire, filled the new one with water, and put it in its place. No sooner was the water in the kettle getting warm than a strange thing happened, and the man, who was standing by, thought he must be dreaming. First the handle of the kettle gradually changed its shape and became a head, and the spout grew into a tail, while out of the body sprang 4 paws, and in a few minutes the man found himself watching, not a kettle, but a tanuki. The creature jumped off the fire and bounded about the room like a kitten, running up the walls and over the ceiling, till the old man was in an agony lest his pretty room should be spoilt. He cried to a neighbor for help, and between them they managed to catch the tanuki and shut him up safely in a wooden chest. Then, quite exhausted, they sat down on the mats and consulted together what they should do with this troublesome beast. At length they decided to sell him, and bade a child who was passing send them a certain tradesman called Jimmu. When Jimmu arrived the old man told him that he had something which he wished to get rid of, and he lifted the lid of the wooden chest where he had shut up the tanuki. But to his surprise no tanuki was there, nothing but the kettle he had found in the corner. It was certainly very odd, but the man remembered what had taken place on the fire, and did not want to keep the kettle any more. So after a little bargaining about the price, Jimmu went away carrying the kettle with him. Now Jimmu had not gone very far before he felt that the kettle was getting heavier and heavier, and by the time he reached home he was so tired that he was thankful to put it down in the corner of his room, and then forgot all about it. In the middle of the night, however, he was awakened by a loud noise in the corner where the kettle stood, and raised himself up in bed to see what it was. But there was nothing there except the kettle, which seemed quiet enough. He thought that he must have been dreaming, and fell asleep again, only to be roused a second time by the same disturbance. He jumped up and went to the corner, and by the light of a lamp that he always kept burning he saw that the kettle had become a tanuki, which was running round after his tail. After he grew weary of that, he ran on the balcony, where he turned several somersaults from pure gladness of heart. The tradesman was much troubled as to what to do with the animal, and it was only towards morning that he managed to get any sleep. But when he opened his eyes again there was no tanuki, only the old kettle that he had left there the night before. As soon as he had tidied his house, Jimmu set off to tell his story to a friend next door. The man listened quietly and did not appear so surprised as Jimmu expected, for he recollected having heard in his youth something about a wonder-working kettle. "Go and travel with it, and show it off," he said, "and you will become a rich man. But be careful first to ask the tanuki's leave, and also to perform some magic ceremonies to prevent him from running away at the sight of the people." Jimmu thanked his friend for his counsel, which he followed exactly. The tanuki's consent was obtained, a booth was built, and a notice was hung up outside it, inviting the people to come and witness the most wonderful transformation that ever was seen. They came in crowds, and the kettle was passed from hand to hand, and they were allowed to examine it all over, and even to look inside. Then Jimmu took it back, and setting it on a platform, commanded it to become a tanuki. In an instant the handle began to change into a head, and the spout into a tail, while the four paws appeared at the sides. "Dance," said Jimmu, and the tanuki did his steps, and moved first on one side and then on the other, till the people could not stand still any longer and began to dance too. Gracefully he led the fan dance, and glided without a pause into the shadow dance and the umbrella dance, and it seemed as if he might go on dancing forever. And so very likely he would, if Jimmu had not declared he had danced enough, and that the booth must now be closed. Day after day the booth was so full it was hardly possible to enter it, and what the neighbor foretold had come to pass, and Jimmu was a rich man. Yet he did not feel happy. He was an honest man, and he thought that he owed some of his wealth to the man from whom he had bought the kettle. So one morning he put 100 gold pieces into it, and hanging the kettle once more on his arm, he returned to the seller of it. "I have no right to keep it any longer," he added when he had ended his tale, "so I have brought it back to you, and inside you will find 100 gold pieces as the price of its hire." The man thanked Jimmu, and said that few people would have been as honest as he, and the kettle brought them both luck, and everything went well with them till they died, which they did when they were very old, respected by everyone. Adapted from Japanese Marchen. End of chapter 36. Recording by Jenny Lundak, South Padre Island, Texas. Recorded in March 2011. End of The Crimson Fairy Book by Andrew Lang.